They told this story as a love triangle, two sisters and a duke, tangled in scandal and silk. But that version is a lie built for drawing rooms and whispered gossip. The real story is about something far uglier. It is about the night Eveline Ashcroft watched her husband disappear into a moonlit garden 3 hours after their wedding, and what she found when she followed him into the dark. It is about what happens when a woman discovers that every person she has ever trusted has been performing a carefully rehearsed betrayal. If that kind of reckoning interests you, stay until the very end of this one. You will not regret it. The cathedral bells of St. Aldrich had barely stopped ringing when the first crack appeared. June 14th, 1814. A Tuesday. The kind of day that starts golden and ends in wreckage, though nobody standing in the nave of the cathedral that morning could have predicted it. The Ashcroft-Blackthorne wedding had been announced 6 months prior, and in that half year the social machinery of London had worked itself into a frenzy of anticipation. The union of Lady Eveline Ashcroft, youngest daughter of Viscount Ashcroft, to Lord Cedric Blackthorne, the 4th Duke of Ravenscar, was being called the match of the decade by people who measured human worth in acreage and annual rents. Eveline stood at the entrance of the cathedral in a gown that had taken 4 seamstresses 11 weeks to complete. Ivory silk, hand-stitched lace imported from Brussels. A train long enough to fill the aisle behind her like a pale river. She was 19 years old, and she was shaking so badly that her father had to grip her arm twice to keep her steady. "Straighten up," Viscount Ashcroft muttered through a smile that never reached his eyes. "Half the peerage is watching." "I know," Eveline whispered. "Then act like you deserve to be here." That was the thing about her father. He could reduce a lifetime of effort to a single inadequacy in 6 words or fewer. Eveline had spent 19 years trying to earn something from him that she could never quite name, and in that moment, walking toward the altar where the most powerful unmarried man in England waited, she still felt like she was falling short. The cathedral was packed, 300 guests, maybe more. Eveline could feel their eyes crawling over her gown, her posture, the careful arrangement of her hair. She heard the whispers that floated through the congregation like smoke. Beautiful bride, lucky girl, astonishing match. Nobody whispered about the groom, because you did not whisper about Cedric Blackthorne. You either praised him to his face or you said nothing at all. He stood at the altar with the stillness of a man who had long ago decided that the world would arrange itself around him, not the other way around. Tall, dark-haired, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood that beauty and cruelty could occupy the same bone structure without contradiction. His eyes were the color of old whiskey, and they held the same warmth, which is to say, almost none unless you were the kind of person who confused intensity with affection. Cedric Blackthorne was 31 years old. He controlled estates in 4 counties. He sat on the Privy Council. He had buried his first wife 3 years earlier under circumstances that polite society had agreed, through collective silence, never to examine too closely. And now he was marrying again because a man in his position needed an heir, and an heir required a wife, and a wife required a ceremony, and a ceremony required a cathedral full of witnesses who would later describe the event as magical. It was not magical. It was a transaction dressed in flowers. Eveline reached the altar. Her father released her arm with a small push, transferring her from one form of ownership to another. Cedric did not smile. He looked at her the way a man looks at a document he has been told to sign, briefly, thoroughly, without sentiment. "You look adequate," he said. "Not beautiful, not radiant. Adequate." That single word told Eveline everything she needed to know about her marriage. But she was 19 and still believed that cold men could be warmed, that distance was just another form of shyness, that a woman's patience could unlock chambers in a man's heart that he had sealed shut for good reason. She would learn otherwise. But not yet. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed. The bishop pronounced them husband and wife with the practiced ease of a man who had married hundreds of couples and remembered none of them. Cedric kissed her once, briefly, on the mouth. His lips were dry. The kiss lasted exactly long enough to satisfy propriety, and not a fraction of a second longer. Then it was done. The reception was held at Blackthorne House, the Duke's London residence, a sprawling Georgian mansion on the edge of Mayfair that had been in the family for 4 generations. The ballroom alone could have swallowed Eveline's childhood home twice over. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across parquet floors. An orchestra played from a raised gallery. Champagne circulated on silver trays carried by footmen whose uniforms probably cost more than Eveline's governess had earned in a year. Eveline moved through the celebration like a beautiful ghost. She smiled. She accepted congratulations. She danced twice with elderly earls who held her too tightly, and once with a viscount's son who spent the entire waltz staring at her chest. Through it all, she tracked Cadric with her peripheral vision, noting how he occupied the room. Not socially, the way other men did, drifting from group to group, collecting laughter and handshakes. Cadric occupied space the way weather does. You were simply aware of him. He stood near the east wall for most of the evening, conducting quiet conversations with men whose faces Eveline did not recognize, and every few minutes someone would approach him, and something in the way they held their shoulders told her they were afraid. Her sister Vivian found her near the refreshment table around 10:30. "Well," Vivian said, pressing a glass of champagne into Eveline's hand. "You did it." Eveline Ashcroft was 23, taller than Eveline by 2 inches, darker in coloring, sharper in features, and possessed of a confidence that Eveline had spent her entire adolescence envying. Where Eveline was soft, Vivian was angular. Where Eveline hesitated, Vivian decided. Their mother had died when Eveline was 4, and Vivian had filled the vacuum with a particular brand of older sister authority that hovered somewhere between protective and suffocating. "I did it," Eveline repeated, and the words tasted strange. "How does it feel, being a duchess?" "Like wearing someone else's shoes." Vivian laughed. It was a sharp sound, and later, when Eveline replayed this conversation in her memory 10,000 times, she would notice that the laugh carried something underneath it, something that was not amusement at all. "You will grow into it," Vivian said. "Give it time." "How much time?" "However much it takes." Vivian's eyes drifted across the ballroom, and for a moment they seemed to catch on something, or someone, near the east wall. Then she looked back at Eveline and smiled. "I should go. Lord Pemberton wants to bore me about his horse." She disappeared into the crowd. Eveline drank her champagne and watched her sister's dark head navigate through the glittering mass of bodies, and she thought nothing of it. She thought nothing of the way Vivian's path through the room bent slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the east wall where Cadric stood. She thought nothing of it because she had no reason to think anything of it. Not yet. The evening wore on. 11 o'clock. Midnight. The celebration showed no signs of slowing. Eveline's feet ached. Her smile had fossilized into something that no longer required conscious effort. She had danced with 14 different men and remembered the conversations from none of them. She was standing near the terrace doors, contemplating the logistics of removing a 20-pound wedding gown without assistance, when she realized Cadric was gone. Not stepped away. Not briefly absent. Gone. She scanned the ballroom. He was not at the east wall. Not among the card players in the side salon. Not in the smoking room, where she checked despite the impropriety of a woman entering. She asked his valet, a thin man named Hargrove, whose face seemed designed for the delivery of bad news. "His Grace stepped out for some air, Your Grace. He often requires solitude in the evenings." "Solitude," Eveline repeated. "On our wedding night." Hargrove's expression did not change. "His Grace is a man of particular habits." There it was again, that language, particular, adequate, words that meant nothing and everything simultaneously, words that built a wall around a man so effectively that questioning the wall itself felt like a breach of etiquette. Eveline should have gone to bed. That was the sensible course of action, the expected course of action. A new bride retiring to her chambers, waiting prettily for her husband to appear whenever his solitude was satisfied. 100 social rules and 1,000 years of aristocratic conditioning pointed her toward the staircase, toward the bridal suite, toward patience. She went to the garden instead. The night air hit her skin like cold water. June in London, but the temperature had dropped, and the sky was clear enough to see stars through the city's haze. Blackthorn House sat on 3 acres of formal gardens, hedgerows and gravel paths and ornamental fountains that had been designed to impress foreign diplomats. In daylight, they were merely beautiful. At midnight, they became something else entirely. Shadows pooled between the hedges like dark water. The fountains whispered. The gravel crunched under Eveline's satin shoes, and each step sounded obscenely loud in the silence. She followed the main path toward the rose garden, then veered left where the hedgerow formed a natural corridor leading to a small clearing with a stone bench. She did not know why she chose that direction. Instinct, maybe. Or the sound. Because there was a sound, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the hedge wall. A voice. Low. Urgent. Male. Cadrick's voice. Eveline stopped. Her heart was doing something unpleasant in her chest. A rapid, irregular percussion that she associated with the moment just before receiving news that would change something permanently. She pressed herself against the hedge. The leaves were wet with dew and they soaked through the shoulder of her gown, but she did not care. She edged along the corridor, one hand on the hedge wall, until she reached a gap in the foliage where the branches had thinned, and she looked through. The clearing was lit by a single lantern someone had placed on the stone bench. In its circle of light, Cadrick stood with his hands on the arms of a woman. Not gripping, holding. The way you hold someone you have held 1,000 times before. The gesture had the terrible ease of long practice. The woman's face was turned away. She was wearing a dark evening gown, and her hair was down, which struck Eveline as strange because no woman of quality walked the grounds of a formal celebration with her hair unbound unless she had loosened it deliberately. Then Cadrick spoke, and the words arrived in Eveline's ears with the clarity of a bell struck in a silent room. "I told you this would be the last time." "You have said that before," the woman answered. Her voice was steady, almost amused. "You said it in March. You said it in April. And yet here we are. This is different. I am married now. You were engaged in March and April. Did that stop you?" "Vivian." The name detonated in Eveline's skull. "Do not say my name like that," the woman said, turning her face toward the lantern light. "Like you are trying to push me away with the sound of it." Eveline's sister stepped fully into the glow. "Vivian." Her hair was loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were bright with something that Eveline recognized as the particular intensity that comes from wanting something you know is destroying you. She looked at Cadrick the way drowning people look at shore. "This ends tonight," Cadrick said. "Does it?" "It has to." "Why? Because you stood in a cathedral and made promises to my sister?" "You made promises to me first, Cadrick. 2 years of promises. Do those expire because a bishop waved his hand?" "They expire because I chose differently." "You did not choose. Your title chose. Your estate chose. Your dead father's will chose. You needed the Ashcroft connection, and Eveline was the price, and you paid it, and now you are standing here in the dark with me, because we both know what that means." Cadrick's jaw tightened. Even in the dim light, Eveline could see the muscles working beneath his skin. "What it means is that I honored my obligation." "Obligation?" Vivian laughed, and it was the same sharp sound from the ballroom, and now Eveline understood what lived beneath it. Rage. Grief. The particular agony of watching someone you love choose someone else in front of 300 witnesses while wearing your sister's face. "You call this obligation? You courted me for 2 years. You wrote me letters. You told me things you have never told another living soul. And then your solicitor informed you that marrying the younger Ashcroft daughter would secure better terms on the land transfer, and you dropped me like a broken tool." "That is not what happened." "That is exactly what happened. Your solicitor drew up 2 proposals, Cadrick. I know because I found them. One with my name, one with Eveline's. And you chose the one that came with an extra 400 acres. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eveline had ever heard. She was shaking, not with cold, not with fear, with something that she would later recognize as the first stage of a fundamental reorganization of her understanding of reality. Every assumption she had carried into this day was disintegrating. The courtship that had felt rushed but flattering. The proposal that had arrived through her father, not through Cadrick directly, with specific language about family alliances and mutual benefit. The curious absence of warmth in every interaction she had ever had with her new husband. The way Vivian had looked at her at dinner 3 weeks ago, during the engagement party, with an expression that Eveline had interpreted as pride, but now understood to be something between pity and controlled fury. She had been chosen like acreage, evaluated like a parcel of land, married for her surveyor's report. And her sister. Her sister had watched the entire thing happen and said nothing, had helped Eveline select her wedding gown, had held her hand when the pre-wedding nerves made her stomach rebel, had stood beside her in the cathedral as maid of honor while carrying 2 years of secret history with the groom. Eveline pressed her hand against her mouth to stop any sound from escaping. In the clearing, Vivian stepped closer to Cedric. "Tell me you feel nothing. Look me in the eye and say it, and I will walk away tonight and never speak of this again." Cedric stared at her. The lantern threw shadows across his face that made him look older, damaged, like a portrait left too long in a room with no light. "I feel nothing," he said. But he said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed so many times that the rehearsal itself has become a kind of confession. The denial so practiced, it became proof. Vivian studied him for a long moment. Then she reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. "Liar," she whispered, and he did not remove her hand. Eveline backed away from the gap in the hedge. Slowly, carefully. One step, then another, the wet gravel shifting beneath her satin shoes with tiny sounds that she was certain would betray her, but neither Cedric nor Vivian heard because they were too consumed by whatever private catastrophe they had been building for 2 years. She made it back to the main path. Then she walked, and the walking became faster, and the faster walking became something close to running, and by the time she reached the terrace doors she was gasping, her chest heaving, the bodice of her 20-pound wedding gown digging into her ribs like a cage. The ballroom swallowed her back. Music, laughter, heat. The celebration continued as though the foundation beneath it had not just cracked open. No one noticed the bride's flushed face. No one noticed the dew stains on her shoulder or the dirt on her satin shoes. They were too busy being wealthy and beautiful and drunk to register that the woman of the hour had just discovered that her marriage was a lie. Her husband was a fraud, and her sister was a traitor. Eveline took a glass of champagne from a passing footman. She drank it in 3 swallows. Took another. Drank that too. Then she stood in the middle of the most lavish celebration she had ever attended and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not cry, she would not confront, she would not scream or collapse or make a scene that would give every gossip in London material for the next 6 months. She would watch, she would learn. She would understand exactly how deep this betrayal went, and exactly who had known about it, and exactly what leverage existed in the tangled web of obligations and secrets that held these people together. And then she would burn every last one of them to the ground. The decision settled into her like an iron rod being driven through soft earth. It straightened her spine. It dried her eyes. It transformed the champagne trembling in her hand into something steadier, colder, more deliberate. A young baroness approached her, cheeks flushed from dancing. "Your Grace, you look absolutely radiant." The ceremony was beyond beautiful. "Thank you," Eveline said, and her voice was perfectly even. "It was everything I expected." "The Duke must be so pleased." "The Duke," Eveline said, "is exactly the man I thought he was." The Baroness beamed, hearing a compliment. Eveline let her hear it because the truth was not yet ready to be spoken. The truth needed time. It needed architecture. It needed to be built into something with walls and doors and windows that could be opened at precisely the right moment to let the light pour in and illuminate every ugly thing that had been hiding in the dark. Eveline was 19 years old. She had been a duchess for approximately 8 hours, and in those 8 hours she had received the most expensive education in the history of English society. She had learned that love is a word people use when they want you to hold still while they take what they need from you. She had learned that family is not blood. Family is whoever has decided that your destruction would be inconvenient for their plans. And she had learned that the most dangerous thing in any room is not the person with the most power. It is the person everyone has decided does not matter. Cedric returned to the ballroom 20 minutes later. His cravat had been retied. His hair was slightly damp, as if he had splashed water on his face. He found Eveline near the orchestra gallery and placed his hand on the small of her back. "We should retire," he said. "The guests will talk if we delay much longer." "Of course," Eveline said. "Whatever you think is best." She said it the way a wife was supposed to say it, agreeable, pliable, grateful for direction. And something in Kaedric's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or might have been relief, because he had expected difficulty and received compliance, and compliance was the only thing he knew how to handle. They climbed the staircase together while the remaining guests applauded. The bridal suite was on the third floor. It had been prepared with fresh flowers, new linens, a fire in the grate. Someone had placed a bottle of wine on the side table with 2 glasses, and the domesticity of the gesture struck Eveline as almost unbearably cruel. Kaedric closed the door. He removed his coat. He poured wine. He handed her a glass. "Today went well," he said. "Yes." "Your father seemed satisfied." "My father is always satisfied when his investments perform." Kaedric looked at her. A real look, the first one he had given her all day, and for a moment Eveline thought she saw something behind the whiskey-colored eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Or the faintest edge of alarm, the instinct of a man who has just heard something in a sentence that he cannot quite identify, but knows he should pay attention to. "You are tired," he said, exhausted. "Then we should sleep." He turned away, removed his waistcoat, sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots. Every movement precise, efficient. The choreography of a man who has learned to fill intimate spaces with mechanical action so that no room remains for the kind of vulnerability that intimacy actually requires. Eveline stood at the window and looked out at the garden. From this height, she could see the clearing. The lantern was gone. The stone bench was empty. Whatever had happened there had been cleaned away with the same efficiency that Kaedric applied to everything, but Eveline could still see it. She would always be able to see it. Vivian's hand on his chest, his failure to remove it, the word liar hanging in the night air like something too heavy to fall. She turned from the window. "Kaedric." "Yes." "When did you decide to marry me?" A pause. Barely noticeable, the kind of pause that only someone who was listening for it would catch. "Your father and I discussed the arrangement last autumn." "And before that?" "Before that, what?" "Before you discussed it with my father. Was there someone else, someone you considered first?" The silence stretched. 3 seconds. 5. 10. In the firelight, Kaedric's face was a mask carved from something harder than stone. "No," he said. "There was no one else." The lie arrived clean and polished, like a knife that had been sharpened for exactly this purpose. He delivered it without hesitation, without any of the tells that amateur liars display. No averted eyes, no nervous hands, just a clear, direct falsehood spoken with the same authority he used to address Parliament. And Eveline smiled. Not because the lie was convincing, not because she believed it. She smiled because in that single word she understood the precise dimensions of what she was dealing with. A man who could look his wife in the eye on their wedding night, 3 hours after holding another woman in the dark, and deny everything without a tremor. This was not a man who had stumbled into betrayal. This was a man who had built it, carefully, deliberately, with the same precision he applied to his estates and his politics and every other system he controlled. "Good night, Kaedric," Eveline said. "Good night." She lay down, closed her eyes, listened to his breathing slow into something that approximated sleep, though she suspected a man with that many secrets never truly slept. In the darkness of her bridal suite, on the first night of her fraudulent marriage, Eveline Ashcroft began to plan. She did not yet know the shape of her revenge. She did not yet know the mechanism or the timeline or the specific instruments she would use. But she knew, with a certainty that sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, that the man lying beside her and the sister who had betrayed her, and the father who had sold her, and every single person who had treated her as a minor character in someone else's story, would eventually understand something that none of them had bothered to consider. Eveline Ashcroft had been watching people her entire life, watching and listening and cataloging and filing away every gesture, every expression, every unguarded moment. She had done it because she was the younger sister, the quieter one, the one nobody considered important enough to guard their words around. They had handed her the weapon themselves. Every careless conversation, every whispered secret, every assumption that she was too naive or too stupid or too insignificant to matter. The first light of dawn touched the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 5. Kedrick shifted in his sleep, murmuring something she could not quite catch. But Eveline was not listening to him anymore. She was listening to the silence, that enormous, patient silence that fills the space between a wound and its reckoning. And inside that silence, something was taking shape. Something with teeth. Down the hall, in the guest quarters of Blackthorn House, Eveline Ashcroft sat on the edge of her bed with her sister's wedding invitation in her hands, reading the words for the 100th time. She had not slept. She would not sleep. Because every time she closed her eyes, she saw Kedrick standing at the altar, and beside him, her little sister in white, and the distance between the three of them was exactly the width of a lie that Vivian had helped build and could no longer escape. She folded the invitation, placed it in the drawer of the nightstand, and then she opened the drawer again and removed something else. A letter, sealed with Kedrick's personal signet, dated 3 days before the wedding. 4 sentences. No greeting, no signature, just 4 sentences in the handwriting she had memorized 2 years ago, the handwriting that used to make her pulse race and now made her stomach drop. She read the 4 sentences again. Then she held the letter over the candle on the nightstand, watching the paper darken, curl, begin to smoke. She should burn it. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to burn it and forget it and let the marriage proceed and find some way to live with what she had done. Vivian pulled the letter back from the flame. She could not burn it, because those 4 sentences were the only proof that existed of what Kedrick Blackthorn had promised her the week before he married her sister. And if the day ever came when promises needed to be accounted for, this letter would be the match that set the whole cathedral on fire. She placed it back in the drawer, closed it, and in the room at the end of the hall, Eveline's eyes opened in the gray dawn light, and she stared at the ceiling, and she whispered a single word into the silence that no one heard. When? Not if. When? Not if. When? That word lived in Eveline's chest for 6 weeks like a second skeleton. It held her upright at breakfast when Kedrick sat across the table reading correspondence and never once looked up. It kept her voice steady during afternoon calls when society women complimented her on the wedding, on the gown, on the extraordinary good fortune of marrying a man whose name alone could open every door in England. It anchored her hands in her lap during the endless carriage rides through Hyde Park, where she sat beside her husband in public silence while London watched and envied. 6 weeks of performing, 6 weeks of smiling at a man who had lied to her face on their wedding night with the ease of someone commenting on the weather. 6 weeks of watching. And the watching was the thing that kept her sane, because every observation was a brick, and bricks could be stacked, and stacked bricks became walls, and walls became architecture, and architecture could be weaponized if you understood the load-bearing points. Eveline understood load-bearing points. She had been studying them her entire life without knowing it. The household ran on a schedule that Kedrick had established years before her arrival, and saw no reason to adjust. Breakfast at 8, correspondence until 10, meetings with solicitors, land agents, or parliamentary allies until 2, a brief appearance in the drawing room if guests were expected, dinner at 7, always formal, always observed by staff whose loyalty to the Duke predated Eveline's existence by decades. The machine had been running long before she arrived, and her role within it was purely decorative. She was the frame around a painting that had already been hung. Hargrove, the valet, managed the Duke's personal schedule with the precision of a military campaign. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, controlled the domestic staff with the quiet authority of a woman who understood that her power depended entirely on Kedrick's continued satisfaction. Between them, they formed a wall of operational competence that made the Duchess functionally unnecessary. Eveline tested the wall, gently at first. She asked Mrs. Calloway about the weekly menus and received a smile and a detailed explanation that contained no actual information. She inquired about Kedrick's schedule and was told that His Grace preferred to manage his own affairs. She suggested rearranging the flowers in the morning room and was informed that the current arrangement had been selected by the Duke's late first wife and had remained unchanged as a matter of tradition. The message was clear. This house belongs to his past. You are a guest in it. She absorbed the message without reaction, filed it alongside everything else. What she did not file, what she carried in a different compartment entirely, was the pattern she had begun to detect in Vivian's movements. Her sister visited Blackthorn House twice in those first 6 weeks. Both visits were announced. Both were conducted in the drawing room with tea and appropriate conversation and a chaperone in the form of Eveline herself. Vivian was warm, attentive, sisterly. She asked about the household. She complimented Eveline's new role. She brought a book of pressed flowers as a gift and spent 20 minutes discussing the arrangement with the kind of animated enthusiasm that made everyone in the room believe she was genuinely delighted by her sister's happiness. Eveline watched her sister's performance and recognized it instantly because she was delivering one of her own. But the visits were not what interested her. What interested her were the letters. 3 weeks into the marriage, Eveline had discovered that the Morning Post was sorted by Hargrove before it reached the breakfast table. Letters addressed to the Duke went directly to his study. Letters addressed to the Duchess were placed on a silver tray near her plate, and letters addressed to neither of them specifically, but to Blackthorn House, went into a secondary stack that Hargrove processed at his own discretion. It was in this secondary stack that certain letters disappeared. Eveline noticed because she had started counting. She watched the postman deliver each morning from the upstairs window. She counted the items he carried. She then counted the items that appeared on the breakfast table and in Cadrick's study. The numbers did not always match. On 3 occasions in 6 weeks, one letter went missing from the total. Not misdelivered, not delayed, simply absent from the accounting, as if it had entered the house and been swallowed by the walls. She did not confront Hargrove. Confrontation was information spent. Instead, she adjusted her schedule. She began rising earlier, appearing in the downstairs hallway at 6:45 under the pretext of wanting fresh air before breakfast. This put her in proximity to the service entrance, where the post was received by the junior footman before being transferred to Hargrove's custody. On the 4th attempt, she saw it. Hargrove met the footman in the service corridor, took the post, and sorted it standing up, his back to the wall. He worked quickly. Most items went into the main stack. 2 went into the Duke's pile, and 1, a cream-colored envelope with no return address, went directly into the inside pocket of Hargrove's coat. His face betrayed nothing. The motion was seamless, practiced, embedded in muscle memory. This was not a new arrangement. This was infrastructure. Eveline retreated to the morning room and sat with her hands folded and her pulse hammering and a smile on her face that could have hung in a portrait gallery. So, the letters were being intercepted, not by Cadrick directly, by his man, which meant either Cadrick had ordered the interception, in which case the letters contained something he wanted hidden from his wife, or Hargrove was acting independently, in which case the valet's loyalty included maintaining secrets that predated the marriage. Either possibility led to the same conclusion. Someone was writing to this house in a way that required concealment, and the concealment was professional enough to have operated undetected for what Eveline now suspected was years. She needed one of those letters. The opportunity came on a Wednesday. Cadrick left for Parliament at 9. Hargrove accompanied him, as was customary when the Duke attended sessions that might run late. The house emptied of its 2 most vigilant occupants simultaneously, leaving Eveline alone with Mrs. Calloway and a staff whose attention she had spent 6 weeks training to ignore her. She went to Cadrick's study. The door was locked. She had anticipated this. What she had not anticipated was the quality of the lock, a Brahma design that she had no means of picking. She stood in the corridor for 30 seconds, recalibrating, and then she did something that the old Eveline, the wedding day Eveline, would never have considered. She lied. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, finding the housekeeper in the linen room, "the Duke asked me to retrieve a document from his study before he left this morning, and I'm afraid I forgot until just now. He mentioned it was time-sensitive. Could you unlock the door for me?" Mrs. Calloway looked at her, a long, evaluating look that contained its own calculations. The housekeeper had managed this house through one duchess's death and one duke's grief, and she had not survived that tenure by being stupid. "His Grace does not typically ask anyone to enter his study in his absence," Mrs. Calloway said carefully. "I understand, but he was quite specific this morning. A letter from his solicitor regarding the Ashcroft land transfer. My father's name is on the document, which is why he asked me to handle it. The land transfer, that was the key. Because Mrs. Calloway knew, as everyone in the household knew, that the marriage itself had been built on a property arrangement, and invoking that arrangement gave Eveline's request a legitimacy that pure curiosity would not have carried. The housekeeper hesitated for 3 more seconds. Then she produced a key from the ring at her waist and walked Eveline to the study door. "I will wait here, Your Grace." Of course. The study was smaller than Eveline had expected. Dark wood, heavy curtains, a desk the size of a small country, covered in papers arranged with the obsessive neatness of a man who controlled his environment because he could not control anything else. Bookshelves lined 3 walls. A portrait of the first Duchess of Ravenscar hung above the fireplace, a dark-haired woman with a severe mouth who looked nothing like Eveline and everything like Vivian. Eveline felt that observation land in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. She moved to the desk, searched the papers, found correspondence from solicitors, land agents, 3 members of Parliament, and a wine merchant in Bordeaux. Nothing incriminating, nothing personal. The desk drawers were locked with a secondary mechanism, and she did not have time to address them. She turned to the bookshelves, ran her fingers along the spines, checked behind the volumes where the wall met the shelf, and found nothing but dust and the small corpse of a spider. 40 seconds gone. Mrs. Calloway was waiting. Eveline scanned the room one final time, and her eyes caught on the fireplace mantel. Below the portrait, a small wooden box, the kind used to store pipe tobacco or collar stays. Unremarkable. The kind of object that becomes invisible through sheer ordinariness. She opened it. Inside, folded into a square the size of her palm, was a single sheet of paper, cream-colored. No envelope. The same stock as the letters Hargrove had been intercepting. Eveline unfolded it. 4 lines, written in a hand she recognized because she had grown up watching it sign birthday cards and school reports, and letters to distant cousins. Vivian's handwriting. The words were not a love letter. They were worse. They were logistics. The Ashcroft Autumn Ball, September 12th. Father will be in the East Wing until 11. The library will be empty after 9. Do not use the main staircase. Not passion, not longing, not the tortured poetry of forbidden love. This was a schedule. A set of instructions for a meeting that had been planned with the same operational precision that Hargrove used to sort the Morning Post. This was not an affair driven by emotion. This was an affair run like a campaign. Eveline refolded the note, placed it back in the box, closed the lid. Her hands were perfectly steady. She walked back to the door where Mrs. Calloway waited with an expression that suggested she had been counting seconds. "I found what I needed," Eveline said. "Thank you." "Of course, Your Grace." Mrs. Calloway locked the door behind them and returned the key to her ring, and the sound of the lock clicking home was the sound of a cell door closing on every version of this marriage that Eveline had tried to believe in. She went to her room, sat on the bed, stared at the wall for 11 minutes, which she knew because she counted each one, using the counting as a mechanism to prevent the scream that was building in her chest from reaching her mouth. The Ashcroft Autumn Ball was September 12th, 6 weeks away. Her father's annual showcase, where the family paraded its connections and alliances before the cream of society. Every year the same guest list, every year the same rituals, and this year, apparently, the same secret arrangement that had been operating under the surface of her family's life while Eveline, the younger sister, the quiet one, the one who did not matter, had been too busy being obedient to notice. How many times? How many autumn balls and spring gatherings and Christmas dinners and idle Tuesdays had Vivian and Kaedric used as cover for their meetings? How many times had Eveline sat in the next room, or the next floor, or the next wing, while her sister and her husband conducted their logistics 10 feet away? She pressed her fist against her sternum, hard, harder, until the pain in her body matched the pressure in her chest and gave her something physical to organize her thoughts around. The old response would have been tears. Confrontation. A scene that would have given Kaedric the excuse to frame her as hysterical and Vivian the opportunity to play the remorseful sister. That response would have cost Eveline everything and changed nothing. The new response was different. September 12th, the Ashcroft Autumn Ball. Vivian had provided the schedule. The library after 9. Father in the East Wing until 11. Eveline would attend that ball. She would watch every entrance and exit. She would track every movement, and she would begin building a record of evidence so thorough, so meticulously documented, that when the time came to deploy it, there would be no room for denial, no space for reinterpretation, no gap through which Kaedric or Vivian could escape into the comfortable fiction that it had all been a misunderstanding. But she needed more than one note. One note was gossip. One note was a scorned wife grasping at paper. She needed volume. She needed pattern. She needed the kind of evidence that did not require interpretation because it interpreted itself, which meant she needed to become invisible in her own house. She was already halfway there. They had made her invisible without trying. All she had to do now was weaponize it. The weeks between July and September became Evelyn's education. She learned the rhythms of the household the way a hunter learns the migration patterns of prey. She memorized Hargrove's schedule. She mapped Mrs. Calloway's blind spots. She identified which servants were loyal to Kaedric by conviction, which by compensation, and which by simple inertia. And she cultivated the third category with small kindnesses that cost nothing and accumulated slowly into something resembling trust. She discovered that the second footman, a young man named Thomas, had a sister in service at the Ashcroft estate. She discovered that the kitchen maid, a girl barely older than Evelyn herself, had been dismissed from a previous household for a pregnancy that ended badly and had been hired by Blackthorn House because Kaedric's first wife had taken pity on her. She discovered that Mrs. Calloway's authority, which appeared absolute, actually rested on a single pillar, the Duke's assumption that the household ran itself. Remove that assumption, and the entire structure would shift. Evelyn did not remove it, not yet. She simply noted where the load-bearing points were and filed the information alongside everything else. Meanwhile, she performed. She attended dinners. She smiled at Kaedric across candlelit tables and said the things a new duchess was supposed to say. She accompanied him to 2 social functions where she stood at his side and allowed London to admire the match and envy the couple and construct the narrative that everyone preferred. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscar. Young, handsome, destined for a great dynasty. Evelyn heard the words repeated so often they lost their meaning, the way any word does when you say it enough times. They became sounds, empty containers that the world filled with whatever story it wanted to believe. Kaedric, for his part, seemed satisfied with the arrangement, not pleased. Satisfaction and pleasure were different currencies in his economy. He was satisfied the way a man is satisfied when a machine he has built operates within expected parameters. Evelyn did not embarrass him. She did not make demands. She did not question his schedule, his absences, or the locked study door. She was, by every metric he cared to apply, adequate. That word again. His highest compliment, the ceiling of his capacity for human acknowledgement. There were moments, rare and brief, when something else surfaced. A dinner in late July where Evelyn mentioned a book she had been reading, a treatise on agricultural reform that she had found in the library, and Kaedric looked at her with something that was not condescension. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the mask reassembled itself, and he changed the subject to the wine, and the moment was buried under the weight of everything he refused to be. Evelyn noted those moments, not because they gave her hope. Hope had been surgically removed on her wedding night. She noted them because they were structural weaknesses. Points in Kaedric's armor where the metal was thinner, where the rivets did not quite hold, where pressure applied at exactly the right angle might cause something to crack. September arrived like a held breath being released. The morning of the 12th, Evelyn dressed with a deliberation that bordered on ritual. She selected a gown the color of deep burgundy, not the pale pastels that society expected of a young duchess, not the modest cuts that signaled deference and gratitude and all the other emotions she was supposed to be feeling. Burgundy, the color of old wine, the color of dried blood, the color of something that had aged past prettiness and arrived at power. Her maid, a quiet girl named Lucy who asked no questions and followed instructions precisely, arranged her hair higher than usual, less soft, more architectural. Kaedric noticed. She saw it in the way his eyes tracked over her when she descended the staircase at Ashcroft Hall. Not the dismissive survey of adequacy, something sharper, something that recognized a change without being able to identify its source. "New gown," he said. "Yes." "It suits you." 3 words, the most generous personal observation he had offered her in 3 months of marriage. Evelyn filed them away and moved through the entrance hall toward the sound of the gathering. The Ashcroft Autumn Ball was everything it always was. 200 guests, an orchestra, enough champagne to float a small vessel. Her father moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who understood that hosting was just another form of control, and Eveline watched him and recognized the same qualities she saw in Kedrick, and understood for the first time that she had married a copy of her father, which was either a failure of imagination or a cruelty so precise it could only be hereditary. Vivian was there. Of course she was. Wearing emerald green, which made her dark hair look almost black, standing near the windows with a group of women whose laughter carried across the room like breaking glass. She caught Eveline's eye and smiled, the warm, sisterly, perfectly calibrated smile that Eveline had been receiving her entire life and had only recently learned to read as camouflage. The evening proceeded. Eveline danced. She conversed. She played the Duchess with a competence that was starting to feel less like performance and more like a second skin she was growing over the original. And she watched the clock. 8:30, 9, 9:15. At 9:20, Vivian excused herself from the group near the windows. She did it smoothly, the way someone does who has excused herself from 100 rooms without drawing attention. A touch on a companion's arm, a murmured word, a step backward, then another, then a pivot toward the corridor that led to the east wing. Eveline counted to 60. Then she followed. The corridor was dimmer than the ballroom. Wall sconces threw long shadows across the carpet. Eveline moved silently, her satin shoes making no sound on the thick pile, and she thought about the fact that this house had trained her for this exact purpose. Years of being the quiet sister. Years of occupying rooms without disturbing them. Years of learning how to exist in spaces where she was not expected and not wanted and not noticed. She reached the library door. It was closed. Light leaked from beneath it, a thin yellow line that cut across the dark carpet like a boundary marker. Eveline did not open the door. She did not press her ear to the wood. She stood 3 feet away, in the shadow between two sconces where the light did not reach, and she waited. Voices. Low. The words indistinct, but the cadences were unmistakable. Vivian's sharp staccato. Kedrick's measured baritone, not arguing, not making love, talking. The way people talk when they have been talking for years and have developed a private language that operates below the threshold of formal speech. She heard her own name, once, clearly. Then Kedrick's voice dropped even lower and the words became sounds without edges, and Eveline stood in the dark and breathed and counted and waited. 12 minutes. That was how long they were in the library together. 12 minutes of muffled conversation that Eveline could not decipher but did not need to, because the fact of the meeting was the evidence, the schedule, the location, the timing, all exactly as Vivian's note had specified. The door opened. Vivian emerged first. Her face was composed. Her hair was untouched. She turned left, toward the ballroom, and walked away without looking back. Kedrick emerged 30 seconds later. He turned right, toward the smoking room, and disappeared around the corner. 30 seconds. They had rehearsed the interval. They knew exactly how much separation was needed to avoid being seen leaving the same room at the same time. The precision of it was its own kind of brutality. Eveline stood in the shadow for another full minute. Then she walked back to the ballroom, found a glass of champagne, and stood near the orchestra gallery. And when Vivian returned 4 minutes later and caught her eye and smiled and raised her own glass in a toast, Eveline smiled back. Because now she had a date, a location, a duration, and a pattern. 1 data point was suspicion. 2 was coincidence. 3 was a case. She needed 3. And the autumn social season, with its relentless calendar of balls and dinners and country weekends, was about to provide her with 100 opportunities to collect them. Eveline took a slow sip of champagne. Across the room, her father laughed at something a cabinet minister said. In the far corner, Kedrick re-emerged from the smoking room and resumed his position near the east wall, scanning the crowd with the proprietary gaze of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. And between them, moving through the ballroom with the fluid confidence of a woman who had never once doubted that the world would arrange itself to accommodate her desires, Vivian Ashcroft raised her glass to her lips and drank, and her eyes, for a single unguarded second, drifted toward the east wall where the Duke stood. Nobody noticed. Nobody except Eveline. 3 weeks later, at Lady Pemberton's harvest dinner, the second meeting happened. Same pattern, same choreography. Vivian excused herself at 9:15. Cadric disappeared 8 minutes later. They reconvened in an unused morning room on the second floor for 14 minutes, then emerged separately and re-entered the party from different doors. Eveline documented everything: dates, times, locations, duration. She wrote the details in a small leather notebook that she kept inside a hollowed-out copy of a devotional poetry collection, the one book she was certain no one in Blackthorn House would ever open. 2 data points. Pattern confirmed. The third came on October 4th at a dinner hosted by the Earl of Westmarch, and this time Eveline got close enough to hear words. She had positioned herself in an alcove adjacent to the billiard room where Vivian and Cadric had retreated. The wall between the alcove and the billiard room was old plaster, and old plaster transmitted sound the way water transmits ripples. Vivian's voice came through first, and there was an edge to it that Eveline had never heard in public, a rawness that sounded like something that had been compressed for too long and was starting to fracture under its own pressure. "How long are we going to do this?" "As long as necessary," Cadric answered. "Necessary for whom? For you? For the arrangement? Because it stopped being necessary for me the moment you married her." "You knew the terms." "I knew the terms you dictated. I never agreed to them." "Your presence here suggests otherwise." A pause. Eveline pressed her shoulder blades against the plaster and held her breath. "You are a cruel man, Cadric. I am a practical man. There is no difference. There is an enormous difference. Cruelty is indiscriminate. Practicality has objectives. And what is your objective right now? Keeping me quiet? Keeping me available? Making sure I stay close enough to be useful but far enough away to be deniable? My objective is to manage a situation that neither of us can undo. You could undo it. You could tell her. Tell her what? That I married her because her family's land was strategically valuable and her sister was socially inconvenient? That this entire arrangement is a transaction with a pulse? Yes, tell her that. Give her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. The truth would destroy 3 families and end my career in government. The truth would free her. I did not marry her to free her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense. The kind of silence that exists between 2 people who have said everything they can say and have arrived at the wall beyond which words cannot reach. Then Vivian spoke again, and her voice had changed, quieter, flatter, the voice of someone watching a fire die. You do not love her. Love is not relevant. You do not even see her. She sits across from you at breakfast, and you look through her like she is made of glass. What I see or do not see is not your concern. It is my concern because I put her there. I let this happen. I watched my sister walk into a marriage I knew was hollow because I was too afraid to tell her the truth, and now she is living inside a lie that I helped build, and every time she smiles at me, I want to put my fist through a window. Eveline's fingernails dug into her palms. She did not move. She did not breathe. She let Vivian's words enter her body and travel to the place where she was storing everything, that dark, patient, expanding archive that was growing larger with every meeting she documented and every word she overheard. Cadric's response came after a long interval. Then stop smiling back. Footsteps. The billiard room door opened and closed. Then silence. Eveline stayed in the alcove for another 3 minutes. Her palms were bleeding where her nails had broken the skin. 4 small crescents on each hand, red and precise, like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence she had not yet written. 3 data points. 3 meetings, 3 sets of dates, times, locations, durations, a pattern documented with the precision of a legal filing. And now, something new. Dialogue. Cadric's own words spoken in his own voice, in a room he believed was private. I did not marry her to free her. Love is not relevant. Words that would strip every pretense of respectability from the marriage if they ever reached the right ears. Eveline returned to the party. She found Cadric near the east wall, exactly where he always stood, and she walked to him and placed her hand on his arm, and the gesture was so perfectly wifely that several nearby guests smiled at the sight. "Are you enjoying the evening?" she asked. Kedrick looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face, and something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something she had never seen there before. Not guilt, not affection. Wariness. The instinct of an animal that has detected a change in the air but cannot yet identify its source. "Well enough," he said. "And you?" "Very much," Eveline said. "I am learning so much about how these events work. The patterns, the rhythms, who goes where and when. It is really quite fascinating once you start paying attention." She felt his arms stiffen beneath her fingers. A microcontraction, barely perceptible, the body responding to a threat that the mind had not yet processed. "You have an unusual interest in social mechanics," he said. "I have an unusual amount of time to observe them." Their eyes met. For 3 seconds, the masks slipped and something raw passed between them. Something that was not love and not hate, but the terrible electric awareness of two people who have just realized they are playing the same game from opposite sides of the board. Then Kedrick smiled. A small, controlled expression that involved his mouth but not his eyes. "Observation is an undervalued skill," he said. "I agree," Eveline said. "Most people overlook the quiet ones." She removed her hand from his arm and walked away, and she felt his gaze on her back like a handprint. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who has just shown a card she cannot take back, that the dynamics of this arrangement had permanently changed. Kedrick Blackthorne was now aware that his wife was watching. He did not yet know what she had seen. He did not yet know about the notebook hidden inside the poetry collection, or the 3 documented meetings, or the conversation she had overheard through old plaster. He did not yet know that the quiet, adequate, conveniently invisible woman he had married was constructing something in the silence that he could not see and would not recognize until it was already too late. But he knew something had shifted, and that knowledge, that single grain of sand in the machinery of his control, was going to change what happened next. Because a man who suspects he is being watched does one of 2 things. He becomes more careful, or he becomes more reckless. Eveline was counting on reckless. And across the room, standing near the windows with a glass of champagne she had not touched, Eveline Ashcroft stared at the place where her sister's hand had rested on Kedrick's arm, and something moved across her face that was not jealousy and not remorse, but the slow, sickening recognition that the game she thought she understood had just acquired a third player. And across the room, standing near the windows with a glass of champagne she had not touched, Eveline Ashcroft stared at the place where her sister's hand had rested on Kedrick's arm, and something moved across her face that was not jealousy and not remorse, but the slow, sickening recognition that the game she thought she understood had just acquired a third player. That third player spent the next 7 weeks becoming the most admired woman in London. Not by accident, not through charm or beauty, or any of the passive currencies that society valued in its women. Eveline rebuilt herself the way an engineer rebuilds a bridge after a flood. She studied the load. She identified the stress points. She designed something that could bear weight that the original structure was never meant to carry. It started with Lady Montford's salon. Lady Montford was 63 years old, widow of a former Lord Chancellor, and the unofficial gatekeeper of political society in London. Her Thursday afternoon gatherings were not social events. They were intelligence exchanges. The women who attended were not decorative. They were the wives, mothers, and daughters of the men who ran the empire, and they understood, far more clearly than their husbands suspected, that information moved faster through drawing rooms than through Parliament. Eveline had received an invitation to Lady Montford's salon within a week of her marriage, but had declined, on Kedrick's advice, because he considered the gatherings frivolous. She now accepted, and she attended not as the quiet Duchess of Ravenscar, demure and grateful for the invitation, but as a woman who listened with the kind of focused intensity that made other women want to tell her things. She asked questions, not the polite surface-skimming questions that society expected, specific questions about household management and estate finances and the particular mechanics of how influence was actually exercised in a world where women held no official power but controlled nearly everything that mattered. Lady Montford noticed. On the 3rd Thursday, after the other guests had departed, the older woman asked Eveline to stay for tea. "You are not what I expected," Lady Montfort said. "What did you expect?" "Another ornament. Blackthorne collects them. His first wife was the same. Beautiful, obedient, miserable." Eveline held her teacup steady. "What happened to his first wife?" "She died. Officially, a fever. Unofficially, a woman who had been disappearing for years finally finished the job." The words hung between them like smoke. "I am not disappearing," Eveline said. Lady Montfort studied her the way a jeweler studies a stone, looking for flaws that are actually just light entering from an unexpected angle. "No, you are not, which is why I want to know what you are actually doing at my salon, because it is not needlework and gossip. I am learning." "Learning what?" "How things work, who owes whom, where the pressure points are in a system that pretends to run on tradition but actually runs on favors and secrets." Lady Montfort set down her teacup. The porcelain clicked against the saucer with a sound like a small bone breaking. "You are describing power, Duchess." "Yes. Most women your age describe love. Most women my age have not been married to Cadric Blackthorne." Something changed in Lady Montfort's expression. Not softness. Recognition. The look of someone who has been waiting for a particular kind of person to walk through the door and has just realized they have arrived. "Come back next Thursday," Lady Montfort said. "Come early. There are things I think you should know." Over the following weeks, Lady Montfort became Eveline's cartographer. She mapped the invisible terrain of London's power structure with the detail and dispassion of a woman who had spent 4 decades navigating it. She explained which families held genuine influence and which merely performed it. She identified the 3 men whose opinions actually shaped Crown policy and the 6 women who shaped those 3 men. She described the mechanisms by which reputations were built and destroyed, which were not the same mechanisms because building required patience and destroying required only timing. And she told Eveline about Cadric. Not the public Cadric, not the Duke who sat in Parliament and managed estates and attended functions with the glacial composure of a man who had confused control for competence. The other Cadric. The one that London's drawing rooms had been discussing in whispers and half-sentences for the better part of a decade. His first wife, Catherine, came from the Hale family, Lady Montfort said during one of their private sessions. Old money, no political ambition, Catherine was gentle, quiet, the kind of woman who believed that if she loved a difficult man hard enough, he would eventually become easy. He did not become easy. He became worse. Because gentleness, to a man like Blackthorne, is not a virtue to be honored. It is a surface to be walked on. Catherine spent 4 years trying to reach him, and each year she got smaller, not physically, spiritually. She contracted. She stopped attending events. She stopped writing letters. She stopped speaking to anyone outside the household. The last time I saw her, 6 months before she died, she was sitting in my garden staring at a rosebush, and when I asked her how she was, she said the most terrifying thing I have ever heard a woman say. "What?" She said she could not remember what her own voice sounded like. Eveline's chest compressed around something that felt like a premonition. "And then she died," Lady Montfort continued. "And Cadric buried her with full honors and wore black for exactly the prescribed period, and then resumed his life as though she had been a lease that had expired rather than a person who had been erased." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are collecting ammunition, Duchess. I can see it in the way you catalog every piece of information I give you, and I want you to understand what you are arming yourself against. This is not a man who will fold under pressure. This is a man who has already survived the destruction of one wife and emerged with his reputation intact. Whatever you are planning, it needs to be something he has never seen before, because everything he has seen before, he has beaten." Eveline absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything since the wedding night, by allowing it to enter the archive without altering the architecture. Each new fact was a load-bearing element. Each element supported a structure that was growing more complex and more dangerous with every passing week. But the structure was not yet complete, because there was a variable she had not accounted for, and that variable was about to detonate. November 8th, a Tuesday. Eveline had spent the morning reviewing correspondence and the afternoon attending Lady Montfort's salon. She returned to Blackthorne House at 4 o'clock, earlier than usual because a headache had been building behind her eyes since noon, and she wanted nothing more than a dark room and silence. She entered through the main hall, handed her coat to the footman, climbed the staircase toward her private sitting room on the second floor, and stopped. Voices. From the corridor that connected the sitting room to the master suite. A corridor she rarely used because Kaedric's rooms were on the other side of it, and the unspoken geography of their marriage kept them on separate sides of the house. Not Kaedric's voice, not Vivian's, her father's. Viscount Ashcroft was standing in the corridor outside the master suite, and he was speaking to Hargrove, and his voice had the clipped, pressurized quality of a man who is working very hard to keep himself from shouting. "I need to see him, now." "His Grace is not receiving visitors this afternoon, my lord." "I am not a visitor, I am his father-in-law." "Be that as it may, His Grace has given instructions that he is not to be disturbed." "Hargrove, I have ridden 3 hours from the country estate in a carriage that rattled my spine loose. I have information that concerns the Duke's interests directly. If you do not open that door in the next 10 seconds, I will open it myself, and then we will discover together what kind of conversation follows." A pause. The sound of a door being unlocked. Footsteps entering the master suite. The door closing. Eveline stood on the staircase, halfway between floors, and the headache behind her eyes had been replaced by something sharper. Her father was here, unannounced. 3 hours from the country, with information that concerned Kaedric's interests. She removed her shoes, held them in one hand, climbed the remaining stairs in stockinged feet, and moved down the corridor to the point where it bent toward the master suite. The door was closed, but the walls here were the same old plaster as the billiard room at the Earl of Westmarch's estate, and sound traveled through them like water through a crack. Her father was already talking. Fast. The veneer of controlled authority stripped away by whatever had driven him 3 hours across rough roads. "Someone has been asking questions about the marriage settlement." A silence. Then Kaedric's voice, measured, careful. "What kind of questions?" "The financial kind. A solicitor named Crane operates out of Lincoln's Inn. He has been making inquiries about the terms of the land transfer, specifically about whether the terms were negotiated before or after the engagement was announced. Those records are sealed. Sealed records can be unsealed by someone with sufficient motivation and the right connections. Crane has been asking clerks, registry officials, the surveyor who assessed the Ashcroft northern parcels. He is building a timeline." "A timeline of what?" "Of your decision-making process, Kaedric. Of how you chose which daughter to marry and why. If Crane assembles that timeline completely, it will show that you evaluated both proposals simultaneously, that you were in active negotiations for Vivian's hand while courting Eveline, that the switch happened because the Eveline proposal included 400 additional acres that the Vivian proposal did not." Eveline pressed her back against the wall. The plaster was cold through her dress. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, in her temples, in the hollow of her throat. "Who hired Crane?" Kaedric said. Not a question, a demand. "I do not know. I have made inquiries. No one is claiming responsibility." "Then find out, because if that timeline reaches certain people, it does not merely damage the marriage, it damages the land transfer itself. The Crown approved the consolidation on the understanding that it was a marital settlement negotiated in good faith. If it becomes public that the settlement was the reason for the marriage rather than the consequence of it, the entire arrangement could be reviewed. I am aware of the implications." "Are you?" "Because the implications include the loss of those 400 acres, which you need almost as much as I do, and the possible reversion of the Ashcroft northern parcels to Crown control, which would end your family's financial recovery before it begins." Eveline heard her father's breathing change, heavier. The breathing of a man being cornered by facts he already knew but had been hoping to avoid. "There is another possibility," her father said. "Which is?" "Eveline." The name landed in the silence like a stone dropped into a well. Eveline heard the impact, felt it reverberate through the plaster at her back. "Eveline," Kaedric repeated. The word carried no inflection, which was itself an inflection. "She has been behaving differently. You must have noticed. The salons, the social calls, the questions she has been asking." She went to Lady Montford's, Cadric. Lady Montford does not invite ornaments. She invites operators. Your daughter has been attending social functions. That is what duchesses do. My daughter has been attending intelligence gatherings. That is what strategists do. And I am telling you, if she has discovered anything about the marriage settlement or about Vivian, she has the temperament and the access to cause damage that neither of us can contain. The silence that followed was longer than any silence Eveline had ever heard. It stretched across seconds that felt like geological epochs, and inside it she could feel the tectonic plates of her situation grinding against each other, shifting, preparing to rupture. Then Cadric spoke, and his voice was different, lower, colder. The voice of a man making calculations that involved human beings the way an accountant's calculations involve numbers. If Eveline is the source, then we have a domestic problem, not a legal one. Domestic problems can be managed. Managed how? By adjusting her access, reducing her social calendar, ensuring that her interactions are supervised by people whose loyalty is not in question. You are talking about imprisoning your wife. I'm talking about managing risk. There is a difference. There is no difference, and you know it. You tried this approach with Catherine, and it ended with a coffin. The words detonated. Eveline felt them land in her chest like shrapnel, and something behind her sternum cracked. Not broke. Cracked. The way ice cracks when weight is applied to its center, the fracture lines radiating outward in every direction simultaneously. Catherine, the first wife, the woman who could not remember what her own voice sounded like, the woman who disappeared until there was nothing left to disappear. They were planning the same thing for her, not with malice. That was the worst part. Not with cruelty or hatred or even conscious intention. With management. With the calm procedural efficiency of men who had identified a risk to their assets and were implementing containment protocols. Eveline was not a person in this conversation. She was a variable. A number in a column that needed adjusting. Her father had driven 3 hours to discuss this. Her father who had walked her down the aisle and handed her to Cadric like a deed being transferred. Her father, who had known about Vivian and Cadric, must have known, because the two proposals existed, because someone had negotiated them, and that someone was the Viscount Ashcroft, who had offered both daughters to the same man and let the acreage decide which one he kept. Eveline's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the plaster wall and held them there until the trembling transferred into the stone and left her muscles artificially steady. Inside the room, her father was still talking. We need to address this carefully. If Eveline is conducting her own investigation, confronting her directly will confirm whatever suspicions she has. We need to determine the extent of her knowledge before taking action. Agreed. I will speak to Hargrove. He manages the correspondence. If she has been communicating with anyone outside the usual channels, he will know. And Vivian? What about Vivian? If Eveline knows about Vivian, then Vivian is the vulnerability, not the land settlement, not the financial records. Vivian. Because a wife can survive a bad marriage negotiation and still maintain her position. But a wife who has been publicly cuckolded by her own sister, that is a scandal that nothing survives. Not the Duke, not the family, not the Crown's confidence in either of us. Vivian is handled. Vivian is not handled. Vivian is barely contained. I have seen the way she looks at you in public, and if I can see it, others can see it, and it is only a matter of time before one of those others decides that the information is worth more as currency than as gossip. I said she is handled, and Catherine was handled, and now Catherine is in the ground. Silence. Eveline peeled herself from the wall. She walked back down the corridor in stockinged feet, each step deliberate, precise, soundless. She descended the staircase. She put her shoes back on. She walked to the morning room and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the garden, where 5 months ago she had watched her husband hold her sister in the dark. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped, replaced by something else entirely, a stillness that was not calm but its opposite, the absolute zero that exists at the center of an explosion, the point where motion ceases because energy has accumulated past the threshold of movement and is preparing to become something else. Everything she had built over the past 4 months, the evidence, the documented meetings, the overheard conversations, the network of relationships at Lady Montford's salon, The careful, patient architectural revenge she had been constructing brick by brick in the silence of her invisibility, all of it was now operating on a timeline she did not control. They knew. Not everything, not the specifics, but they suspected, and suspicion in men like Kedrick and her father was not a passive state. It was a trigger. They would act. They would restrict her access, monitor her communications, reduce her world to the dimensions of a gilded cage, and they would do it with the same cold efficiency that had already consumed one woman and left nothing behind but a headstone and a politely sealed record. She could not wait for the winter masquerade. That had been her original timeline. December 21st, the grandest social event of the season, 300 guests, foreign ambassadors, the perfect stage for a public revelation that would strip Kedrick and Vivian bare before the people whose opinions actually mattered. That timeline was dead. They would have her contained long before December, which meant she needed a new plan, a faster plan, a plan that did not rely on patience or architecture or the slow accumulation of evidence deployed at the perfect moment. She needed something immediate, something irreversible, something that could be executed before Kedrick and her father finished their calculation and implemented their containment. And she needed it now, today. Before the conversation upstairs finished and the machinery of her imprisonment began to turn, Eveline stood up from the chair. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, and for a moment she did not recognize the woman looking back. The soft features were still there, the careful hair, the proper posture. But something behind the eyes had changed. Some fundamental architecture of the self had been demolished and rebuilt in the space of 20 minutes, and the new structure was not prettier or gentler or kinder. It was harder. It was sharper. It was the face of someone who had just learned that the people who were supposed to protect her were instead discussing the logistics of her erasure with the same detached professionalism they would apply to closing a failing investment. She walked to her writing desk, opened the drawer, removed a sheet of paper and an envelope. The letter she wrote took 4 minutes. It was addressed to a person she had met at Lady Montford's salon 3 weeks earlier, a woman whose name she had filed away at the time without knowing why. The way you pick up a stone on a beach and put it in your pocket because something about its weight feels significant. Clara Whitfield, editor and publisher of the London Correspondent, the most widely read society paper in England. Eveline sealed the letter, rang for Thomas, the second footman whose sister worked at the Ashcroft estate. Thomas, I need this delivered by hand within the hour, not through the regular post, directly. And Thomas, yes, Your Grace. This did not happen. Thomas looked at the letter, looked at Eveline, and something passed between them that was not conspiracy but recognition. The look of two people who understand exactly what kind of house they are living in and have independently decided that loyalty should be earned rather than assumed. Of course, Your Grace. What letter? He took the envelope and disappeared through the service corridor. Eveline returned to the window. Outside, the November sky was the color of unpolished steel, and the garden was stripped bare by autumn, every branch visible, every hedge reduced to its skeleton, every hiding place eliminated by the season. Upstairs, she heard a door open and close. Footsteps in the corridor, her father's heavy tread descending the staircase. She turned from the window as he entered the morning room. He looked tired. The 3-hour ride had carved lines around his mouth that she had not noticed before, and for a single disorienting instant she saw him not as her father, but as what he actually was, a 60-year-old man whose entire financial survival depended on the stability of a marriage he had engineered between his youngest daughter and a man who was in love with his eldest. Eveline, he said, I did not know you were home. I returned early. Headache. He nodded, sat in the chair opposite hers, looked at her with the same evaluating expression that Mrs. Calloway used, the expression of someone calculating risk. How are you settling in? The household treating you well? Very well, Father. Good. Good. And Kedrick? He is attentive? Kedrick is exactly the husband you chose for me. Something flickered across his face. A micro-expression that lasted less than a second, but contained, in its brief transit, every lie he had ever told her and every truth he had ever withheld. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of paternal concern that he wore the way other men wore cravats. I worry about you, he said. You have been very busy socially, Lady Montford's salon, the dinners, the calls. It is a great deal for a young woman in her first season as a duchess. I am managing. Perhaps you should slow down. Spend more time at home. There's no rush to conquer London in your first year. Is that your advice or Caedric's? The question landed between them like a blade dropped on a table. Her father's eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter. Enough. Enough for Eveline to know that the conversation upstairs had included specific instructions about how to handle her, and that this concerned father routine was the first implementation of those instructions. It is a father's concern for his daughter, he said carefully. Then I appreciate it, and I will take it under consideration. She smiled at him, the same smile she had been giving everyone for 5 months. Perfect. Warm. Empty. The smile of a woman who has learned that the face is just another locked door, and what happens behind it is nobody's business but her own. Her father stayed for dinner. He sat at one end of the table and Caedric sat at the other, and Eveline sat between them, and the three of them ate roasted pheasant and discussed the weather and the state of the roads and the upcoming parliamentary session, and not one word was spoken about land transfers or sealed records or the slow, methodical containment of a woman who had become inconvenient. After dinner, Eveline excused herself. She climbed the staircase to her sitting room. She closed the door. She locked it. Then she went to the bookshelf, removed the hollowed-out poetry collection, and extracted the leather notebook. She opened it to the last page. Below the entry for October 4th, the third documented meeting between Caedric and Vivian, she wrote a new entry. Today's date, November 8th. And below the date, in handwriting that was steady and small and precise, she recorded every word she had heard through the plaster wall. The land transfer. The 2 proposals. Crane the solicitor, her father's suspicion. Caedric's plan to restrict her access. The reference to Catherine. She read it back. Then she closed the notebook and returned it to its hiding place. The letter to Clara Whitfield was already in transit. By tomorrow morning, the editor of the London Correspondent would have in her hands an invitation to tea from the Duchess of Ravenscar, along with a single sentence that Eveline had chosen with the same precision that Caedric used to choose his lies. I have a story that your readers will remember for the rest of their lives. The winter masquerade was 6 weeks away. Eveline did not have 6 weeks. She might not have 6 days. But she had a letter in transit, a notebook full of evidence, and a fury so compressed and so patient and so structurally sound that it could bear the weight of everything she was about to bring down on the heads of every person who had decided she did not matter. Outside the window, the last light of November bled out of the sky, and somewhere in the house, in the master suite or the study or whichever sealed room he had retreated to, Caedric Blackthorne sat with the awareness that something in his carefully managed world had shifted, and the woman he had married for acreage was becoming something he had never designed for, never planned for, never once considered possible, something he could not manage, something he could not contain, something that was already moving. Clara Whitfield arrived at Blackthorne House on November 10th at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 46 hours after Eveline had sent the letter. She came alone. No assistant. No carriage bearing the masthead of the London Correspondent. She arrived in a hired cab, wearing a plain wool coat and a hat that could have belonged to any middle-class woman visiting any house in Mayfair, and the deliberate anonymity of her appearance told Eveline everything she needed to know about how seriously the editor was taking this invitation. They sat in Eveline's private sitting room. Tea was served by Lucy, the maid who asked no questions, and when Lucy withdrew and closed the door, Clara Whitfield set down her cup without drinking from it and looked at Eveline with eyes that had spent 15 years separating lies from news. "Your letter was interesting, Duchess." "I intended it to be. A story my readers will remember for the rest of their lives. That is a substantial promise." "It is not a promise. It is a description." Clara studied her. 30 seconds of silence in which the editor's gaze catalogued posture, breathing, eye movement, the steadiness of the hands holding the teacup. Clara Whitfield had interviewed cabinet ministers, bankrupts, and at least one woman who had poisoned her husband. She knew what desperation looked like. She knew what performance looked like. And she was trying to determine which one she was seeing now. "Tell me," Clara said. Eveline told her. Not everything, not the notebook. Not the documented meetings or the overheard conversations or the letter from Vivian she had found in Kaedric's study. She told her the shape of the story without revealing the evidence, the way an architect shows a client the elevation drawing before opening the blueprints. A duke who married the wrong sister for acreage, a secret affair maintained before, during, and after the wedding. A father who brokered the arrangement knowing his eldest daughter was already involved with the groom. A household designed to render the wife invisible while the affair continued behind walls that had been built specifically for concealment. Clara listened without interrupting. When Eveline finished, the editor picked up her teacup, drank from it for the first time, and set it back down. If even half of what you are describing is true, this is the largest society scandal in 20 years. It is all true. I will need proof. You will have it. When? When I'm ready. Clara's eyebrows rose. Duchess, I did not come here for a negotiation. I came here because your letter suggested urgency. If you have evidence, show it to me now. If you are fishing for an ally before you have a case, I am not interested. You are interested. You would not be sitting in this room in a borrowed coat if you were not. Something shifted in Clara's expression. Respect, maybe. Or the particular alertness of a woman who has just realized she is dealing with someone who understands leverage. What do you want? Clara said. Not a question. A calibration. I want the story published on my terms, my timeline, my framing. You do not print until I tell you to print. And when you print, the story centers on the deception, not the Duchess. I am not a victim in this narrative. I am the one who found the truth. And if I agree to these terms, what do I get? Exclusive access to documented evidence including dates, locations, and direct testimony. Letters in the Duke's own hand. Correspondence that proves the affair predated the marriage. And a first-person account from the only witness who has been inside the machinery and seen how it operates. Clara was quiet for a long time. Eveline could hear the clock on the mantelpiece ticking, each second a small detonation in the silence. You understand what will happen when this prints, Clara said. This is not a scandal that damages. This is a scandal that destroys. Blackthorn's political career, your father's reputation, your sister's standing in society, and yours, Duchess. Because the world does not reward women who expose their own families, no matter how justified the exposure is. I know. And you are willing to accept that cost. The cost has already been paid. I am simply choosing who receives the receipt. Clara Whitfield stood up. She buttoned her plain wool coat and adjusted her unremarkable hat and looked at Eveline with an expression that was no longer professional evaluation, but something closer to the way one soldier looks at another before a battle whose outcome neither of them can predict. Send word when you are ready. I will hold space in the paper. She left through the service entrance the same way she had arrived, invisible and deliberate. Eveline sat alone in her sitting room and listened to the silence that Clara's departure had left behind. It was a different silence now. Not the passive, suffocating quiet of a house designed to diminish her. This silence had texture. It had direction. It was the silence of a fuse that had been lit but had not yet reached the powder. 3 days. That was how long she estimated before Kaedric and her father implemented their containment plan. 3 days before her social calendar was restricted, her correspondence monitored, her movements tracked by staff whose loyalty had been freshly purchased or reinforced. 3 days to assemble her case, deliver it to Clara Whitfield, and ensure that the machinery of publication was set in motion before the machinery of her imprisonment could catch up. She started that night. Kaedric was at a parliamentary dinner. Hargrove was with him. The house was staffed by the evening skeleton crew, Mrs. Calloway, 2 footmen, a kitchen maid. Eveline waited until 11 when Mrs. Calloway retired to her rooms, and then she went to work. The notebook came out of the poetry collection. She transcribed every entry onto fresh paper, clean copies without the cramped marginalia and cross-references of the original. Dates, times, locations, durations. 3 documented meetings between Kaedric and Vivian, each with supporting detail. The overheard conversation at the Earl of Westmarch's dinner. The conversation between Kaedric and her father, recorded almost verbatim through the plaster wall. She organized the transcriptions chronologically. She cross-referenced them with the social calendar, showing that each meeting coincided with events where Eveline's presence was expected. meaning her absence from adjacent rooms would not be noticed. She annotated each entry with the names of potential corroborating witnesses, servants, and footmen and carriage drivers who had been present at the relevant estates and might, under the right circumstances, confirm what they had seen. Then she retrieved the note from Kiedrick's study, Vivian's handwriting, the logistics of the September meeting. She had copied the contents into her notebook weeks ago, but the original remained in the wooden box on the mantelpiece, and now she needed it physically, which meant another trip to the study. The Brahma lock had defeated her in July. It would not defeat her in November. During the intervening months, Eveline had learned 3 things about Brahma locks. First, they were nearly impossible to pick without specialized tools. Second, they were opened by keys that were unique to each lock. Third, Hargrove carried the key on a chain attached to his waistcoat, which meant the key left the house every time Hargrove left the house, which meant the study was accessible only when the valet was present. But Eveline had also learned a 4th thing, which was that Mrs. Calloway had a master key, not to the Brahma lock, to the service door on the opposite side of the study, a door that connected to the servants' corridor and was secured by a standard lever lock that Mrs. Calloway could open with the ring at her waist. Mrs. Calloway's key ring hung on a hook inside the housekeeper's pantry when it was not on her person. The pantry was locked at night. The pantry lock was a simple warded mechanism that Eveline had practiced opening with a bent hairpin on 6 separate occasions over the past month, using the matching lock on the linen closet as a training ground. She opened the pantry at 11:40, retrieved the key ring, identified the correct key by the small notch that Mrs. Calloway had filed into its head for quick identification, walked to the service corridor, opened the service door to the study. The room was dark. She lit a single candle, moved to the fireplace, opened the wooden box. The note was gone. Eveline stared at the empty box for 5 full seconds. Her hand was still extended, fingers hovering over the velvet lining where the cream-colored paper had been. The absence was absolute. Not displaced, not rearranged, not hidden beneath something else. Simply gone. Removed by someone who knew it was there and had decided it should no longer be. Kiedrick. He had cleared the study. He was already sanitizing, already removing the physical evidence that connected him to Vivian because the conversation with her father had alerted him to the possibility that someone, Crane the solicitor, Eveline herself, an unknown third party, was assembling a case, and a man like Kiedrick responded to that possibility not with denial, but with destruction of the trail. She had been too slow. No. She corrected herself immediately, standing in the dark study with a candle throwing shadows across the portrait of Catherine Blackthorne. She had not been too slow. She had been operating on a timeline that assumed she was the only player. She was not the only player. She had never been the only player. She was a woman in a game designed by men who had been playing it longer and with fewer scruples, and the rules changed every time she thought she understood them. The note was gone, but the transcription remained in her notebook, Vivian's exact words, copied in Eveline's hand, including the specific reference to the library, the date, the instructions about the main staircase. It was not original evidence. It was a record. And a record, without the original to support it, was just one woman's word against a duke's. She needed something else, something Kiedrick could not destroy because he did not know it existed. She returned the key ring, closed the pantry, climbed the stairs to her sitting room, sat at her desk, and thought. The evidence she had was circumstantial without the physical letters. The documented meetings could be dismissed as coincidence. The overheard conversations were her testimony alone, uncorroborated, easily denied. Even Clara Whitfield, sympathetic as she was, would not publish a story built entirely on the word of a scorned wife against the denial of a sitting duke. Eveline needed Vivian, not Vivian's cooperation. Vivian would never cooperate. But Vivian's inability to cooperate was itself a kind of leverage, because Vivian was not Kiedrick. Vivian did not have a valet to intercept letters, or a locked study to hide evidence, or a father willing to drive 3 hours to coordinate containment strategies. Vivian was operating alone, carrying 2 years of correspondence and memory and guilt in whatever personal archive a single woman maintains when she is conducting an affair with her sister's husband. And Vivian's archive was not at Blackthorne House. It was at the Ashcroft estate, in Vivian's rooms. Where their father's surveillance was focused outward, on Crane the solicitor and the external threats, not inward, on his own daughter's private papers. Eveline needed to get to the Ashcroft estate. She needed to get into Vivian's rooms, and she needed to do it before Kadrick's containment plan reduced her world to the walls of this house. Tomorrow. It had to be tomorrow. She slept for 3 hours. Rose at 5, dressed in traveling clothes, wrote a note for Mrs. Calloway explaining that she was visiting her family's estate for the day and would return by evening. She ordered the carriage for 6. The coachman, a man named Briggs who had been with Blackthorn House for 11 years, looked at her with mild surprise when she appeared in the courtyard at dawn. "The Ashcroft estate, Your Grace. That is a 3-hour journey." "I am aware. Shall I inform His Grace?" "His Grace is aware of my plans." The lie came easily. It came easily because she had spent 5 months listening to Kadrick deliver lies with the same casual authority, and somewhere in those 5 months, the technique had transferred. Not through admiration, through necessity. The way a prisoner learns the guard's schedule, not because they respect the routine, but because their survival depends on predicting it. The carriage left Mayfair at 6:15. London was still waking up. The streets were wet with overnight rain, and the early morning light was gray and thin, and the city looked exhausted, like a body that had been awake too long. Eveline sat in the carriage and watched the streets give way to countryside, and felt the vibration of the wheels through the seat cushion and the small of her back, and she thought about Catherine Blackthorn, the first wife, the woman who disappeared. Lady Montfort had said Catherine believed that loving a difficult man hard enough would eventually make him easy. Catherine had been wrong, but Catherine's mistake was not the loving. It was the belief that the difficulty was something to be solved rather than something to be survived. Eveline was not trying to solve Kadrick. She was trying to survive him. And survival, she had learned in 5 months of marriage, was not a condition. It was an action, a continuous, deliberate, exhausting action that required you to dismantle the version of yourself that the world had approved and replace it with something harder, something uglier, something that the old you would not have recognized and would not have liked. The old Eveline would not have liked any of this. The old Eveline would have wept and confronted and made a scene and been managed and contained and eventually erased, the way Catherine had been erased, gradually and then completely. The new Eveline was in a carriage at dawn, traveling 3 hours to rifle through her sister's private correspondence, carrying a notebook full of evidence and a hollowed-out book of poetry, having lied to a coachman, stolen a housekeeper's keys, and formed an alliance with a newspaper editor. She arrived at the Ashcroft estate at 9:15. The house was quiet. Her father was still in London. The staff, familiar with Eveline from childhood, admitted her without question. "Is my sister home?" Eveline asked the butler, a man named Clark who had served the family since before she was born. "Lady Vivian went riding at 8, Your Grace. She typically returns by 10. 45 minutes. Eveline climbed the staircase to the family wing. Vivian's rooms were at the end of the corridor, the same room she had occupied since girlhood. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. This was home. Who locks doors at home? The room smelled like Vivian. A specific perfume, lily and cedar, that Eveline had been smelling her entire life, and that now carried a different chemical signature in her memory. No longer the scent of her sister, but the scent of the woman who had been in her husband's arms 3 hours after the wedding. She searched methodically. Wardrobe first. Nothing in the pockets of hanging garments, nothing in hat boxes, nothing in the false-bottom trunk that Vivian had used to hide sweets as a child, and apparently still used, because inside it, Eveline found a bottle of French brandy and a pair of men's riding gloves that were too large to be their father's. The writing desk was next, unlocked. Letters from friends, invitations, bills from a milliner, a half-finished letter to a cousin in Bath. Nothing incriminating in the main drawers. The bottom drawer was stuck. Not locked. Stuck. As though something inside had shifted and was blocking the mechanism. Eveline pulled harder. The drawer scraped open 6 inches, enough for her to reach inside. Her fingers found a bundle. Paper. Tied with a ribbon. She pulled it out. Letters. 11 of them. Cream-colored envelopes. No return address. The same paper stock as the notes Hargrove had been intercepting at Blackthorn House. Eveline's hands were shaking again. She untied the ribbon, opened the first letter, Kadrick's handwriting. She recognized it from the household correspondence she had seen on his desk. Sharp, angular, compressed. The handwriting of a man who wrote the way he spoke, with precision and without waste. The first letter was dated 18 months before the wedding. Eveline scanned it. The language was not romantic. It was strategic. References to meetings, timelines, the progress of negotiations with Viscount Ashcroft. One line stopped her breathing. Your father has made his position clear. He will not approve our match while the northern parcels remain unresolved. I am exploring alternatives that may satisfy his requirements without sacrificing what we have built. Alternatives. Eveline was the alternative. She was the solution to a land dispute, the human mechanism by which a property negotiation was resolved. Kadrick had written it plainly, without disguise, because at the time he had no reason to disguise it. This letter was never supposed to be seen by anyone except Vivian. She opened the second letter, the third, the fifth, the eighth, the 11th. Each one a waypoint on a timeline that began with a genuine attachment between Kadrick and Vivian and ended with the calculated substitution of one sister for another. The letters documented the evolution of the decision in Kadrick's own words, from reluctance to rationalization to the cold, operational language of a man who had convinced himself that marrying the wrong woman for the right acreage was not betrayal, but management. The ninth letter, dated 2 months before the wedding, contained a paragraph that Eveline read 3 times. I understand your anger. I share it. But anger does not resolve the financial reality that your father has constructed. If I marry you, the northern parcels remain in dispute, and my position in Parliament is weakened by the association with an unresolved land claim. If I marry Eveline, the parcels transfer immediately, the dispute is settled, and our respective families are strengthened. I am not choosing her over you. I am choosing a structure that allows us to continue what we have while securing what we need. Eveline is not an obstacle. She is a bridge. A bridge. She was a bridge. A structural element in someone else's architecture. A plank of wood laid across a gap so that 2 other people could walk over her to reach each other. Eveline put the letters back in the bundle, retied the ribbon, placed them inside her coat, closed the drawer, stood up. 22 minutes had passed. Vivian would return from writing in approximately 23 more. She walked down the corridor, descended the staircase, crossed the entrance hall toward the front door, and stopped, because Vivian was standing in the doorway, not returning from riding, already returned, early, still in riding clothes, boots muddy, hair loosened by wind, cheeks flushed from the cold November air. She was holding a riding crop in her right hand and staring at Eveline with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition, the kind of recognition that arrives when something you have been dreading finally happens, and the dread turns out to have been more bearable than the reality. Eveline, Vivian said, what are you doing here? Eveline felt the bundle of letters shift against her ribs inside her coat. 11 letters. Kadrick's handwriting. 18 months of documented betrayal pressed against her body like a second heartbeat. Visiting my family home, Eveline said. I did not realize I needed permission. You do not need permission. You need a reason. My reason is my own. Vivian's eyes dropped, not to Eveline's face, to her coat, to the slight asymmetry in the fabric where the bundle of letters created a bulge that would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for exactly that shape. Vivian was looking for exactly that shape. Her grip tightened on the riding crop. The leather creaked, her jaw set. And in her eyes, Eveline saw something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The moment when her sister stopped being her sister and became her adversary. Not because the relationship changed, but because the pretense that it had ever been anything else finally collapsed under the weight of its own impossibility. You went into my rooms, Vivian said. It was not a question. Eveline said nothing. She stood in the entrance hall of the house where she had grown up, 12 feet from the woman who had taught her to braid hair and read aloud and navigate the small cruelties of childhood, and she said nothing, because nothing she could say would change what had already happened and what was about to happen next. Vivian stepped forward. 1 step, then another. The riding crop hung at her side like a pendulum. Give them back. No. The word filled the hall. It bounced off the marble floor and the paneled walls and the portrait of their mother that hung above the staircase. The mother who had died when Eveline was 4 and whose absence had created the vacuum into which all of this had poured. Eveline, those letters are mine. Those letters are evidence. Evidence of what? That I love someone? That he loved me? That your marriage is a business arrangement that everyone knew about except you? Everyone did not know. I did not know, and that is exactly the point. Vivian's composure cracked. It did not shatter. It cracked, the way a dam cracks, small fissures appearing in the surface that suggest enormous pressure behind the wall. What are you going to do? Run to the papers? Tell London that the Duke of Ravenscar married the wrong Ashcroft? Do you have any idea what that will do to this family? This family sold me. This family brokered a marriage to a man who was in love with my sister so that father could secure a land transfer. This family watched me walk into a cathedral and say vows to a man who had already decided I was a bridge between his ambitions and his appetites. So do not talk to me about what this will do to this family. This family did this to me. Her voice did not rise. That was what frightened Vivian. Eveline could see the fear arrive in her sister's eyes, not at the words, but at the delivery, the flat, controlled, architecturally precise delivery of a woman who had moved past anger into something colder and more permanent. Eveline, please, we can talk about this. We can find a way to resolve this that does not involve destroying everything. You had 2 years to talk about this. You had 2 years to tell me the truth. You chose to stand beside me as my maid of honor and smile and hold my hand while I shook with nerves before walking down the aisle toward a man who did not want me. You chose silence, and now you want to talk. I was afraid. You were comfortable. There is a difference. Vivian flinched. The writing crop slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor with a crack that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Neither of them moved to pick it up. If you publish those letters, Vivian said, and her voice was shaking now, the first genuine tremor Eveline had heard from her in 5 months of performance, Ciedric will retaliate. You do not know what he is capable of. I know exactly what he is capable of. He told me himself, through a wall he did not know I was standing behind. He is capable of managing risk. He is capable of adjusting access. He is capable of reducing a woman's world until she cannot remember what her own voice sounds like. I know what he is capable of because his first wife is dead, Vivian, and the men who killed her are the same men who are planning to do the same thing to me. Vivian's face went white. Not pale. White. The color of paper, the color of the letters inside Eveline's coat. Catherine's death was a fever. Catherine's death was an erasure, and you know it. You have always known it. Just like you have always known what this marriage was, and what my role in it was, and what would eventually happen to me once I stopped being useful. You knew all of it, and you let it happen because as long as I was the one inside the cage, you were the one who got to stay free. The hall was silent. The clock ticked. Outside, a horse stamped in the courtyard. Impatient, unaware that inside the house, 2 sisters were standing on opposite sides of a chasm that had been opening beneath them for 23 years and had only now become visible. Vivian bent down, picked up the writing crop, held it in both hands. What happens now? She whispered. Eveline looked at her sister, looked at the writing crop, looked at the portrait of their mother on the wall, the woman who would never know what her daughters had become in her absence. Now I leave, Eveline said, and you decide what kind of person you are going to be when this is over. She walked past Vivian, through the doorway, into the November air. The carriage was waiting. Briggs opened the door. She climbed in, sat down, pressed the bundle of letters against her ribs and felt the paper crinkle beneath her fingers like something alive. The carriage pulled away. Eveline did not look back. But if she had, she would have seen Vivian standing in the doorway of the Ashcroft estate, watching the carriage disappear down the drive, and then turning and walking back into the house with a stride that was no longer shaking, no longer uncertain, no longer afraid. Vivian walked to the study, their father's study. She opened the desk drawer, took out a sheet of paper, and began writing a letter to Ciedric Blackthorne, That letter arrived at Blackthorne House at 6 o'clock the following morning, carried by a rider from the Ashcroft estate who had traveled through the night. Hargrove intercepted it at the service entrance, as he intercepted all correspondence bearing the Ashcroft seal, and delivered it directly to the Duke's study before Eveline had risen from a sleep she had barely touched. By 7:30, Kedrick knew everything. He knew Eveline had traveled to the Ashcroft estate. He knew she had entered Vivian's rooms. He knew she had taken the letters. Vivian's account was precise, detailed, stripped of emotion in a way that suggested she had written it in the state beyond panic, the cold, airless clarity that arrives when a person realizes that the structure they have been hiding inside is about to collapse and there is no longer anywhere to run. Kedrick read the letter twice. Then he sat in his study and did nothing for 47 minutes. Hargrove, who had served the Duke for 14 years and had developed the capacity to read his employer's silences the way a sailor reads weather, stood outside the study door and listened to nothing. No pacing, no drawer opening, no pen scratching, just nothing. The absolute silence of a man recalculating every variable in a system that has just suffered a catastrophic failure. At 8:17, Kedrick opened the door. "Cancel my appointments." "All of them, Your Grace?" "All of them, and find Lord Ashcroft. I do not care if he is asleep. I do not care if he is in the bath. Get him here within the hour." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Her Grace?" Kedrick looked at Hargrove. The valet had seen many expressions on his employer's face over 14 years. Anger, contempt, the occasional flash of dark amusement, but this expression was new. It was the face of a man who has just discovered that the person he dismissed as furniture has been building a fire inside the house while he was busy locking the doors. "Her Grace," Kedrick said, "is not to leave this house." 2 hours later, Eveline came downstairs for breakfast and found the front door guarded. Not obviously, not with uniformed men or visible locks. But the first footman was standing in the entrance hall at a position he never occupied. And when Eveline asked for the carriage to be brought around, she was informed that the carriage was undergoing maintenance and would not be available until further notice. She looked at the footman. He did not meet her eyes. She walked to the service entrance. The second footman was there, rearranging boots that did not need rearranging. She went to the garden door, locked. The key was not in its usual place on the hook by the frame. 3 exits, 3 barriers. Installed in the 2 hours since Kedrick had read Vivian's letter. Eveline stood in the corridor between the morning room and the garden door and felt the walls of the house contract around her. Not physically, but the space that the house occupied in her consciousness shifted from a structure she inhabited to a structure that contained her, and the difference between those two things was the difference between living and being stored. This is what Catherine felt, she thought, not all at once, gradually. One locked door at a time, one canceled carriage at a time, one rearranged footman at a time, until the house stopped being a home and became a mechanism, and the woman inside it stopped being a person and became a component, and the component eventually broke because components are not designed to feel, and the feeling had nowhere to go. Eveline did not break. She went to her sitting room. She closed the door. She removed the bundle of letters from the hiding place where she had transferred them the previous night, a space behind the loose baseboard beneath her writing desk that she had discovered in August and told no one about. She counted them. 11, all present. Then she sat at her writing desk and waited. Kedrick came to her at noon. He did not knock. He opened the door and entered the way a man enters a room he owns, which was every room in this house, which was the fundamental architecture of the problem. He closed the door behind him. He did not sit. He stood near the window with his back to the light so that his face was in shadow and hers was illuminated. And the staging was so deliberate, so precisely calibrated to create a power asymmetry that Eveline almost admired the craftsmanship. Almost. "Where are the letters?" he said. "Safe." "That is not what I asked." "That is the only answer you are going to receive." Kedrick studied her. In the shadow, his eyes were darker than usual. The whiskey color deepened to something closer to amber, and behind them Eveline could see the machinery working. Calculations, projections, contingency analyses. The mental architecture of a man who processed human relationships the way engineers process stress tests, looking for the load that would cause failure. "You went to the Ashcroft estate yesterday," he said. "I visited my family home, as I told you." "You did not tell me. You told Briggs. And what you told Briggs was a lie." "I have learned from the best." The silence that followed had edges. It occupied the space between them like a third body, something with its own mass and temperature that pushed them both slightly backward. Eveline, I need you to understand something. Those letters, whatever you think they prove, will not accomplish what you are hoping. And what am I hoping? Revenge, exposure, some dramatic reckoning that equalizes the grievance you believe you are owed. I do not believe I am owed a grievance. I know I am owed the truth. Those are different currencies. The truth will destroy this family. This family destroyed itself. I am simply the one who noticed. Kedrick's jaw tightened. She watched the muscles work beneath the skin, the same involuntary contraction she had observed in the garden on their wedding night, and she realized that this was his tell, not his eyes, which he controlled, not his voice, which he modulated. His jaw. The one piece of his body that still responded to pressure without his permission. "What do you want?" he said. "I want an annulment." The word landed between them, and neither of them flinched, which was itself a kind of mutual acknowledgement that the pretense had been abandoned, and what remained was negotiation between two people who understood each other's leverage with surgical precision. "An annulment," Kedrick repeated, "on the grounds of fraud. You entered this marriage under false pretenses. The courtship was a performance designed to secure a land transfer. The emotional basis for the union was fabricated. The evidence I hold documents these facts in your own handwriting. An annulment would require a hearing. A hearing would require testimony. Testimony would make the contents of those letters public. Yes. Which would destroy not only my reputation, but your father's, and your sister's, and yours. My reputation is what? The naive girl who married a duke and was too stupid to notice he was in love with her sister? That reputation was destroyed on my wedding night. I am simply choosing the terms of its replacement." Kedrick moved. Not toward her, toward the fireplace. He placed his hand on the mantelpiece and looked at the flames, and for a moment the shadow and the firelight fought over his features. And in that unstable illumination, he looked less like a duke and more like what he actually was, a man standing on the edge of something he could not control for the first time in his adult life. "If I agree to the annulment," he said slowly, "what happens to the letters?" "They go to my solicitor. They are sealed. They remain sealed as long as the terms of the annulment are honored. And if I do not agree?" "They go to Clara Whitfield at the London Correspondent tomorrow morning, and by the afternoon edition, every drawing room in London will know that the Duke of Ravenscar married the wrong Ashcroft sister for 400 acres of farmland." The fire crackled. A log shifted and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside the window, November pressed its gray weight against the glass. "You have thought this through," Kedrick said. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment. The voice of a man who has just recognized an opponent he should have identified months ago. "I have had 5 months to think it through. 5 months in a house designed to make me invisible. 5 months watching the machinery operate and mapping every gear and every lever and every point where pressure produces movement. You built this machine, Kedrick. I simply learned how it works." He turned from the fireplace, looked at her directly, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before and would never see again. A flash of something that was not anger and not respect, but the raw, involuntary recognition of one intelligence encountering another for the first time. "You are not the woman I married," he said. "No, I am the woman you created." The meeting with the solicitors took place 3 days later on November 14th in the offices of Clark and Pemberton on Gray's Inn Road. Eveline was represented by a solicitor named Hartwell, whom Lady Montfort had recommended. Kedrick was represented by his own man, a senior partner named Graves, who had handled the Blackthorne family's legal affairs for 2 decades. Viscount Ashcroft was present as an interested party, representing the family whose name appeared on the land transfer documents that had precipitated the entire catastrophe. The meeting lasted 4 hours. In those 4 hours, the marriage of Kedrick Blackthorne and Eveline Ashcroft was dismantled with the same methodical precision with which it had been constructed. Hartwell presented the grounds for annulment. Graves contested them. Documents were exchanged. Arguments were made. Ashcroft sat in the corner and said almost nothing, his face the color of old parchment, watching his carefully engineered family alliance disintegrate clause by clause. At 2 o'clock, Eveline placed the bundle of letters on the conference table. 11 letters. Cream-colored envelopes. Kedrick's handwriting. 18 months of documented decision-making that showed, in his own words, the deliberate substitution of one sister for another based on acreage. Graves read the letters. His face did not change, but his hand, the one resting on the table, curled slowly into a fist. "These are private correspondence," Graves said, "obtained without consent." "These are evidence of fraud," Hartwell responded, "obtained by the victim of that fraud. The method of acquisition is immaterial to their content. The content is subject to interpretation. The content includes the phrase, and I quote directly, 'Eveline is not an obstacle. She is a bridge.' I would be fascinated to hear your interpretation of that, Mr. Graves." Graves looked at Kedrick. Kedrick looked at the letters on the table, at his own handwriting staring back at him from paper he had touched and sealed and sent to a woman who was supposed to keep them hidden forever. And in his face, Eveline saw the precise moment when a man who has spent his entire life controlling outcomes realizes that this outcome is beyond his reach. "What are the terms?" Graves said. The terms were these. The marriage would be annulled by mutual petition on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. The polite legal fiction that allowed both parties to save face in public while acknowledging in private that the union had been fraudulent from its foundation. The land transfer would stand, because unwinding it would damage Crown interests, and neither party wanted royal attention. Eveline would receive a settlement of £12,000 annually, drawn from the Blackthorn estate for a period of 10 years. She would retain the right to use the Ashcroft family name, and the letters would be sealed with Hartwell's firm, held as insurance against any future attempt by Kedrick or her father to damage Eveline's reputation or financial position. There was one additional term, one that Eveline had not discussed with Hartwell in advance, one that she delivered herself, standing at the conference table with 11 letters in front of her and 3 men watching and the weight of 5 months of silence pressing against her lungs. "Kedrick will marry Vivian." The room went still. Kedrick's head came up. Slowly, the way a man's head rises when he hears a sound that does not belong to the world he thought he was living in. "What?" "You will marry Vivian, publicly, within 3 months of the annulment. You will present it as a love match that was delayed by family complications and has now been properly resolved. You will stand in a cathedral and make vows to the woman you actually chose, in front of the same society that watched you make vows to me. And you will do it with a smile on your face and conviction in your voice and the full knowledge that every person in attendance will know exactly what happened and exactly what kind of man you are. That is not a legal term. That is a punishment. It is a consequence. You wanted Vivian. You have always wanted Vivian. Now you will have her. In public. In daylight. Without the secrecy that made it exciting and without the forbidden quality that made it feel like something more than what it actually is, which is 2 people who were too selfish to consider the collateral damage of their choices. You cannot force me to marry someone. I cannot. But I can give those letters to Clara Whitfield if you refuse. And if those letters are published, no woman of quality will marry you for the rest of your life. Vivian will be your only option. So you can marry her now, on my terms, with some dignity preserved. Or you can marry her later, after the scandal, with nothing preserved at all." Kedrick stared at her. 30 seconds of silence in which the entire machinery of his intelligence was deployed against the problem and returned no solution, because there was no solution. Eveline had built a box with no exits. Every option led to the same destination. The only variable was how much damage was sustained in transit. "This is cruelty," he said quietly. "No," Eveline said. "Cruelty is marrying a woman you do not love and letting her believe you might learn to. Cruelty is conducting an affair with her sister 3 hours after the wedding. Cruelty is planning to imprison your wife the way you imprisoned Catherine. This is not cruelty. This is architecture, and you should recognize it because you taught me how to build it." The annulment was finalized on December 3, 1814. The proceedings were conducted privately, as these things were, with only the solicitors and the relevant parties present. Eveline signed the documents with a hand that did not shake, and when the final seal was pressed, she felt something release inside her chest that she had been holding since June, a tension so fundamental to her posture that its absence made her feel momentarily weightless, as though gravity had been recalibrated and she needed to learn how to stand all over again. She walked out of Clark and Pemberton's offices into the December air. London was cold. The streets were wet. The sky was the particular shade of gray that English winters deploy as a form of psychological warfare. And Eveline stood on the pavement in a coat she had bought with her own money, which was a thing she had never done before, and breathed, and the air tasted different than it had that morning. Not better. Different, sharper, more specific. The air of a woman who had cut herself free from a structure that was designed to hold her and was now standing in the open for the first time, unprotected, unsupported, entirely exposed to whatever came next. Lady Montfort was waiting for her in a hired carriage at the end of the street. Eveline climbed in, sat down, exhaled. "Well," Lady Montfort said, "it is done. How do you feel?" Eveline considered the question. She considered it the way she had learned to consider everything over the past 5 months, carefully, from multiple angles, with attention to what the answer revealed about the person asking and the person answering and the space between them. "I feel like a building that has been demolished and is now expected to function as open ground." Lady Montfort looked at her for a long time. Then she reached across the carriage and took Eveline's hand. Not gently, firmly. The grip of a woman who understood that tenderness, in this moment, would be an insult. "Open ground is where things grow," Lady Montfort said. "Buildings just sit there." The carriage moved through London, past the houses of people who did not yet know what had happened, past the clubs and salons and drawing rooms where, in a matter of weeks, the story would begin to circulate. Not the full story. Stories are never full when they pass through society. They are edited, compressed, shaped by the teller's agenda and the listener's appetite. The version that London would eventually receive would be partial, distorted, filtered through 100 retellings until the edges softened and the details blurred and the whole thing became another piece of gossip, entertaining for a season and forgotten by spring. But Eveline knew the full story. She would always know it. And knowing it was its own kind of weight, heavier in some ways than not knowing, because ignorance at least allowed the possibility of comfort. And knowledge, true knowledge, the kind that goes all the way down to the foundations, eliminates comfort permanently and replaces it with something colder and more durable. Understanding. That was what she had now. She understood how the world worked. She understood how power operated, not through force but through architecture, through the careful arrangement of walls and doors and corridors that determined who could go where, and who could see what, and who could speak, and who was expected to remain silent. She understood that the people who built those architectures were not evil, they were afraid. Afraid that the systems they controlled would collapse without the control. Afraid that the people they diminished would grow larger than them if given room. Afraid of the particular vulnerability that comes from treating another human being as an equal rather than as a component. Kedrick was afraid. She understood that now. Not of Eveline, not of scandal. Of the version of himself that existed behind the machinery, the version that had written those letters to Vivian with something that might have been genuine feeling before he learned to convert feeling into strategy. He had buried that version beneath titles and estates and parliamentary careers and 2 marriages, and every layer of burial was another layer of armor, and the armor had become so thick that the man inside it could no longer feel anything except the pressure of its weight. He would marry Vivian. The wedding was scheduled for March. And the marriage would be exactly what Eveline had designed it to be, a public monument to private failure, a ceremony that everyone in attendance would recognize as the formalization of a scandal, a union built not on love, but on the wreckage of love, where every smile would carry the memory of what it had cost, and every vow would echo the vows that had already been broken. They would be miserable. Eveline knew this with certainty because she understood the mechanics. The secrecy had been the engine of their passion. Remove the secrecy and the engine dies, and what remains is 2 people who have to look at each other every morning across a breakfast table and reckon with the fact that the thing they thought was love was actually just the thrill of taking something that belonged to someone else. That thrill does not survive legitimacy. It cannot, because the thrill depends on the transgression, and marriage eliminates the transgression, and without it there is only the ordinary, grinding, daily work of being with another person, and neither Kedrick nor Vivian had ever demonstrated the capacity for that kind of work. Eveline did not feel satisfaction at this knowledge. She had expected to. She had built the punishment into the terms specifically because she wanted Cadric and Vivian to experience the slow, corrosive reality of getting exactly what they had claimed to want. She had wanted them to suffer the way she had suffered, not acutely, not dramatically, but persistently, the way water suffers stone, wearing it down grain by grain until the shape of the thing is unrecognizable. But satisfaction did not come. What came instead was exhaustion. The deep cellular exhaustion of a body and mind that had been operating at maximum capacity for 5 months without rest. And the removal of the enemy was also the removal of the purpose. And without the purpose, the exhaustion had nothing left to hide behind. She spent December in a rented house in Bloomsbury that Lady Montfort had arranged. Small, modest by the standards she had become accustomed to. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen staffed by a single cook and a single maid. The kind of house that Eveline, as the daughter of a viscount and the former wife of a duke, should have considered beneath her. She did not consider it beneath her. She considered it the first space she had ever occupied that belonged entirely to her decisions, furnished by her choices, organized by her preferences, uncontaminated by the expectations and agendas of men who viewed her as infrastructure. She slept 12 hours a night for the first 2 weeks. Her body was repaying a debt that had been accumulating since June, and the payment schedule was brutal. She slept, and she ate, and she walked through Bloomsbury's quiet streets in the early morning, before London was fully awake, and she let the cold air fill her lungs, and she thought about nothing, deliberately, aggressively nothing, because the alternative was thinking about everything, and everything was too large to process in motion. In January, a letter arrived from Clara Whitfield. The story was circulating, not through the London correspondent. Eveline had never given Clara the go-ahead to publish, and Clara, true to their agreement, had held the space without filling it. But stories have their own velocity in London society, and the annulment had generated enough whispers that the outlines of the truth were beginning to emerge through the usual channels. Drawing room speculation. Dinner table insinuation. The slow grinding mill of gossip that processes raw scandal into polished narrative. Clara's letter was brief. She reported that the current version circulating through society was approximately 60% accurate. The affair was known. The land transfer was suspected. Cadric's reputation was damaged but not destroyed. Vivian's was worse. And Eveline, curiously, was being spoken of with something approaching respect, which was the last thing she had expected and the first thing that made her feel something other than exhaustion. Clara had included a clipping from another paper, a smaller publication that covered society events with less restraint than the London correspondent. The clipping described the upcoming Blackthorne Ashcroft wedding, the marriage of Duke Cadric Blackthorne to Lady Eveline Ashcroft, and the language was carefully neutral, but the subtext was visible to anyone who could read between the lines. Phrases like a union long anticipated and the resolution of family considerations and sources close to both parties confirmed that the arrangement was reached amicably. Each phrase a small, polished lie that the writer knew was a lie, and the reader knew was a lie, and yet the lie was printed anyway, because that was how the machinery worked. Eveline read the clipping twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, next to the only letter she had kept from the entire ordeal, the final piece of correspondence she had received from Cadric, delivered by Hargrove to the Bloomsbury house 2 days after the annulment. 4 sentences. No greeting, no signature, just 4 sentences in the handwriting she had memorized during 5 months of reading his correspondence on his desk. You were right. I did not see you. I see you now. That is the worst part. She had read those 4 sentences 100 times in the week since they arrived. She would read them 100 more. Not because they changed anything, not because they offered comfort or closure or any of the neat emotional resolutions that stories are supposed to provide. She read them because they were the only honest words Cadric Blackthorne had ever written to her. And honesty, even late, even insufficient, even delivered after the damage was done and the wreckage cleared, had a weight that dishonesty could never match. He saw her now. Fine. Let him see her. Let him see her from inside the marriage she had built for him. The public, legitimate, inescapable marriage to the woman he had claimed to love. Let him see her every time Vivian's sharp voice cut across the breakfast table, or Vivian's restless ambition pushed against the boundaries of a relationship that no longer had the thrill of secrecy to fuel it. Let him see the woman he had dismissed as a bridge and recognize, in the quiet of whatever solitary moments his new marriage allowed him, that the bridge had been the strongest structure in the entire arrangement, and he had torn it down. And now he was standing on the other side of the gap with no way back. March came. The wedding happened. Eveline did not attend. She heard about it from Lady Montfort, who described the ceremony with the dry, clinical precision of a woman narrating a surgery she had observed from the gallery. It was well attended. The flowers were expensive. Vivian looked like she was walking to her execution. Cedric looked like he was conducting one. Were they convincing? They were adequate. Eveline almost laughed. Almost. The word caught in her chest and sat there, vibrating, carrying more meaning than any single word should be asked to bear. Adequate. His word. The ceiling of his capacity for human acknowledgement. And now the ceiling of his marriage. Spring turned London green. The scandal faded, as scandals do, replaced by newer, shinier outrages that demanded society's limited attention span. Eveline's name moved from the center of conversation to the margins and then off the page entirely, which was exactly where she wanted it. She was not interested in being remembered as the woman at the center of the Blackthorn scandal. She was interested in being the woman who came after. She accepted the position on the Royal Charity Commission that Lady Montfort had recommended. She began attending lectures at the Royal Institution, sitting in the back row, taking notes, asking questions that the lecturers found surprisingly sophisticated for a woman of her background, which was its own kind of compliment and its own kind of insult, and Eveline accepted both with the equanimity of someone who had long ago stopped measuring her worth by other people's expectations. She built something, not a dynasty, not an empire, something smaller and sturdier and more honest, a life that was her own. A reputation that was earned rather than inherited or bestowed or negotiated through marriage contracts and land transfers. The Duchess of Ravenscar was gone. Lady Eveline Ashcroft remained, and Lady Eveline Ashcroft was a woman whose name, when spoken in the drawing rooms and salons of London, carried a particular kind of weight, the weight of someone who had been underestimated and had used the underestimation as fuel. In April, she received a visitor at the Bloomsbury house. Thomas, the second footman from Blackthorn House, appeared at her door in civilian clothes with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that suggested he had been debating this visit for weeks. "Your Grace, my lady, I apologize. I am not sure what to call you now." "Eveline is fine." Thomas looked uncomfortable with that, which she expected. Some distances cannot be closed by permission alone. "I left Blackthorn House," he said, "last week. I could not stay. The household it is different now." Different how? Quiet. But not the good kind of quiet. The kind where you can hear things breaking even when nothing is moving. Eveline nodded. She did not ask for details. She did not need them. She could see the house in her mind, the dark wood and heavy curtains and the desk the size of a small country and the portrait of Catherine Blackthorn above the fireplace. And she could see Vivian sitting in the chair where Eveline had once sat, looking out the window at the garden where it had all started, and she could see Cedric at the east wall of whatever room he occupied, scanning for threats, managing risk, controlling outcomes, the machinery still running but the fuel exhausted and the gears beginning to grind. "Is there anything I can do for you, Thomas?" "I was hoping for a reference, my lady, if it would not be too much trouble." She wrote him one that afternoon. A good one, detailed and specific and generous, because Thomas had carried a letter for her without asking questions and had looked her in the eye and said what letter and that small act of loyalty, unremarkable in the telling, had been one of the load-bearing elements in the structure that saved her life. Summer came. The city emptied as the wealthy retreated to their country estates. Eveline stayed in London. She preferred it empty. The streets were wider without the carriages of people who did not know her name, and the parks were quieter, and the evenings were long, and she filled them with reading and walking and the slow, patient work of becoming a person she recognized. That was the hardest part. Harder than the marriage. Harder than the discovery. Harder than the months of surveillance and evidence gathering and the final confrontation that had ended with solicitors and sealed letters and the dismantling of a fraud. The hardest part was afterward, when the enemy was gone and the battle was over, and what remained was a woman sitting alone in a rented house in Bloomsbury, trying to remember who she had been before someone else decided who she should be, and discovering that the person before was a stranger, and the person during was a weapon, and the person after was still under construction. She was still under construction. Some mornings she woke up and reached for a rage that was no longer there, the way an amputee reaches for a missing limb. The rage had been so constant, so structurally integrated into her daily existence, that its absence felt like a disability. Without it, she was just a 20-year-old woman in a rented house, trying to eat breakfast without thinking about the breakfast table at Blackthorn House, trying to read without thinking about the study she had broken into, trying to sleep without hearing Vivian's voice through plaster walls, and Kaedric's voice in the dark garden, and her father's voice on the staircase, managing risk, adjusting access, discussing her erasure with the same tone they used to discuss the weather. The rage would come back sometimes, in flashes, triggered by small things. A cream-colored envelope in the Morning Post, the smell of lily and cedar in a shop, the sound of a Brahma lock clicking on a stranger's door. It would surge through her body like electricity, hot and bright and purposeful, and for a moment she would feel powerful again, the way she had felt in the entrance hall of the Ashcroft estate, with 11 letters inside her coat and her sister standing in the doorway. Then it would pass. And what remained was not power, it was knowledge. The hard, permanent, unbeautiful knowledge of what people are capable of when they believe their interests are more important than another person's humanity. She did not forgive them. Forgiveness was a word people used when they wanted the injured party to make the injuring party feel better about what they had done. Eveline had no interest in anyone's comfort. What she did, which was harder than forgiveness and less satisfying and infinitely more honest, was release. She released Kaedric from the space he occupied in her thoughts. She released Vivian from the role of villain that Eveline had assigned her. She released her father from the expectation that he would ever be something other than what he was, a man who measured human beings in acreage and always would. She released them not because they deserved it, but because carrying them was a form of captivity, and she had spent enough of her life inside structures built by other people. On a warm evening in late July, Eveline walked through Bloomsbury as the sun set and the light turned the brick buildings the color of old copper. She passed a bookshop, a bakery, a pub where laughter spilled onto the street through open windows. She turned a corner and found herself on a street she did not recognize, which was unusual because she had walked every street in Bloomsbury twice by now, and she realized that she had been so absorbed in her own thoughts that she had wandered beyond her usual routes without noticing. She stopped, looked around. Red brick, iron railings, a small square with a plane tree in the center, its leaves broad and green and alive in a way that felt almost aggressive, as though the tree was making a point about survival that required no translation. A bench beneath the tree, empty. Eveline sat down. She sat there for a long time. The light changed. The shadows moved. The city breathed around her, enormous and indifferent, and full of people whose stories she would never know. People who were being betrayed and doing the betraying and recovering from both, and starting over and failing and trying again. The endless, messy, graceless, stubborn persistence of human beings refusing to be finished. She was not finished. She was 20 years old. She had been married and unmade and rebuilt, and the new structure was not complete and might never be, because the point of being alive was not completion, but construction. The daily, deliberate, sometimes agonizing work of building something from the wreckage that the previous version of yourself left behind. Eveline sat on the bench beneath the plane tree and watched the last of the light leave the sky. She did not think about Kaedric. She did not think about Vivian. She did not think about the autumn ball or the winter letters or the morning she stood in the entrance hall of her childhood home with 11 envelopes pressed against her ribs like a second heart. She thought about tomorrow, about the commission meeting at 10, about the lecture at the Royal Institution at 2, about the letter she owed Lady Montfort and the book she was reading and the bread she needed to buy from the bakery on the corner before it closed. Small things, ordinary things, the things that a life is actually made of when you strip away the scandals and the schemes and the grand dramatic architecture of revenge. She stood up, brushed off her skirt, walked home through the warm evening in a city that did not know her name and did not care, and the anonymity was not loneliness but liberation, the vast, terrifying, exhilarating freedom of being no one's wife and no one's pawn, and no one's bridge. Just Eveline, walking home.